A 12-year-old girl survived Nazi occupation by pretending to be dead for 3 days straight, but what she discovered hiding in that mass grave will haunt your dreams tonight. September 1st, 1939. That's the date when everything changed. Not gradually, not with warnings that gave people months to prepare. Overnight, Germany invaded Poland, and suddenly families across Europe realized their biggest worry wasn't paying bills or getting good grades anymore. It was staying alive. The weird part is how quickly normal life just vanished. One day, kids were complaining about homework, and parents were arguing about whose turn it was to take out the trash. The next day, those same parents were frantically digging holes in their backyards. Not for gardens or swimming pools. For bomb shelters. Picture this scene happening in thousands of neighborhoods simultaneously. Fathers who had never held a shovel for anything more serious than planting roses were suddenly becoming amateur construction workers. Mothers who spent their evenings knitting scarves were now calculating how much food and water a family of 4 would need underground. Children watched their parents transform from the adults who worried about bedtimes into people who worried about bombs falling from the sky. Then there were the windows. Every single window in Europe, it seemed, got covered with thick black curtains almost overnight. These weren't fashionable drapes picked out to match the furniture. They were blackout curtains, designed to make sure not even a sliver of light escaped at night. The idea was simple but terrifying. If enemy planes couldn't see lights below, maybe they wouldn't know where to drop their bombs. But here's what nobody expected. Living behind those curtains felt like being trapped in a cave. Families who used to enjoy evening walks or sitting on their front porches suddenly found themselves locked inside their own homes as soon as the sun set. Children had to learn new rules that made no sense in the world they knew just weeks before. No flashlights near windows. No opening curtains to peek outside. No lights on after dark, period. Schools tried to continue as if everything was normal. Teachers showed up. Students brought their books and lessons started on schedule. Makes sense, right? Except now those lessons got interrupted by air raid sirens. The first time it happened, kids didn't know what to do. Some laughed because the sound was so strange and loud. Others started crying because they could hear the fear in their teacher's voice when she said, "Everyone under your desks, now." What's remarkable is how quickly children adapted to this madness. Within weeks, kids who used to race to the playground during recess were instead racing to bomb shelters. They learned to recognize different types of sirens. The long, steady wail that meant planes were coming. The shorter, choppy sound that meant immediate danger. The single, sustained note that meant all clear. These became as familiar as school bells had been just months earlier. Parents faced impossible choices every single day. Do you send your children to school, knowing they might get caught in an air raid? Do you keep them home, knowing they need education and some sense of normalcy? Do you pack up everything and leave for the countryside, abandoning your job, your house, everything you've worked for? Well, there weren't any good answers. The fear was different from anything people had experienced before. It wasn't fear of losing a job or getting sick. This was fear that you might not wake up tomorrow morning, that your house might be a pile of rubble by evening, that your children might not come home from school. Every goodbye became potentially permanent, and everyone knew it. And the strange thing about fear is how it changes the smallest details of daily life. Families started sleeping in their clothes, just in case they had to run to the shelter in the middle of the night. People kept suitcases packed by the door. Children learned to grab their most precious possessions, maybe a stuffed animal or a photograph, in under 30 seconds. Let's not forget how this affected entire communities. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other before the war suddenly became essential to each other's survival. They shared information about air raids, helped dig each other's shelters, and took turns watching for enemy planes. The war forced people to depend on each other in ways they never had before. But even as families tried to adapt to their new reality, they had no idea what was coming next. The digging of backyard shelters and hanging of blackout curtains was just the beginning. Soon the war would bring something that would terrorize entire cities for months on end, forcing people to sleep underground with strangers, listening to explosions overhead night after night. The real test of survival was about to begin. When Britain declared war in September 1939, most people figured the real fighting would happen somewhere else. They were wrong. By September 1940, German bombers started showing up over London like unwelcome dinner guests who refused to leave. What followed became known as the Blitz, and it lasted 57 straight nights of aerial terror. The first air raid siren that wailed across London caught everyone off guard. People stumbled out of pubs, theatres, and cozy living rooms, wondering if this was just another drill. Within minutes, the distinctive drone of German Heinkel bombers filled the night sky. Then came the explosions. Buildings that had stood for centuries crumbled into dust heaps in seconds. London's underground stations transformed overnight into the world's strangest hotels. Families would pack blankets, thermos bottles, and whatever food they could carry, then head underground before sunset. The platforms that once handled the morning commute now housed thousands of frightened civilians trying to sleep on cold concrete. Children curled up between the railway tracks while their parents sat guard, listening to the muffled thunder of bombs dropping overhead. Dogs proved to be terrible companions during air raids. The moment those sirens started wailing, every dog in the neighborhood would join in with their own howling chorus. This created a domino effect of panic that spread faster than the actual bombing warnings. Smart families learned to watch their pets for early warning signs. Dogs often heard the approaching planes before the official sirens even started. Sleep became a skill that required serious practice. How do you drift off when explosions are rattling your windows every few minutes? Londoners developed what they called blitz sleep, the ability to doze through anything short of a direct hit on their building. Parents would read bedtime stories to their children while anti-aircraft guns boomed in the distance. Some families got so good at this that they could actually sleep through the noise, waking up only when the all-clear signal finally sounded. Every morning brought the same grim routine of assessment and cleanup. Families would emerge from their shelters to find their windows blown out, their gardens filled with shrapnel, and sometimes their neighbor's house simply gone. The cleanup crews became experts at sweeping broken glass, so much glass that some streets sparkled like glitter in the morning sunlight. But here's the thing about Londoners: they refused to let the bombing break their spirit. Shopkeepers would hang signs in their blown-out windows that read "more open than usual." Pubs would serve drinks in coffee cups because all their proper glasses had been shattered. Theatre performances continued even during raids, with actors shouting their lines over the sound of explosions. The really strange part was how normal it all became. Children started playing new games like Bomb Crater and Air Raid Warden. They collected pieces of shrapnel like other kids collected marbles. School lessons happened in underground stations, with teachers holding classes between the railway lines while trains occasionally rumbled past. Food became another challenge entirely during these underground sleepovers. Families would pack sandwiches that had to last through unpredictable raid lengths. Sometimes people were stuck underground for 12 hours, sharing whatever food they'd brought. The lucky ones had neighbors who remembered to pack extra. The unlucky ones learned to make a single sandwich stretch much further than seemed possible. Then there were the false alarms that drove everyone crazy. Sirens would send thousands of people scrambling for shelter, only for nothing to happen. But nobody dared ignore the warnings. So one time you decided to skip the shelter might be the night your building took a direct hit. Emergency workers became the unsung heroes of these nightly ordeals. Firefighters would race toward burning buildings while everyone else ran away. Ambulance drivers navigated streets filled with rubble and unexploded bombs. Air raid wardens walked through neighborhoods during attacks, making sure everyone had reached safety. The psychological toll was harder to measure than the physical damage. Some people developed what doctors called shelter neurosis. They became so afraid of leaving the underground that they practically lived there. Others went the opposite direction, becoming recklessly defiant and refusing to take shelter at all. Communication during raids relied on a network of whistles, bells, and shouted messages. Telephone lines were often cut by bombing, so neighborhoods developed their own systems for checking on elderly residents or families with small children. By the time the Blitz finally ended in May 1941, London looked like a city with several missing teeth. Entire blocks had been reduced to rubble. But somehow, the people had endured 57 nights of terror and were still standing. Yet this was just the beginning of what civilians would face as the war spread across Europe, forcing millions to make impossible choices about where to seek safety and whom to trust with their lives. When the bombs started falling regularly, entire cities emptied overnight. Families who had lived in the same neighborhoods for generations suddenly found themselves stuffing their most precious belongings into suitcases and cardboard boxes. The government's evacuation plans sounded organized on paper, but the reality was pure chaos. Train stations became scenes of heartbreak that would haunt survivors for decades. Parents pushed through crowds, desperately trying to keep their children close while officials with clipboards shouted instructions nobody could hear over the noise. Children as young as 5 years old wore cardboard tags around their necks like luggage, with their names and destinations written in careful handwriting. Many had never been away from home for a single night. The trains themselves were packed beyond capacity. Kids sat on each other's laps, in aisles, and even squeezed into luggage compartments. Some journeys that normally took 2 hours stretched into 8 or 9, with frequent stops as tracks were bombed or cleared for military transport. The lucky ones brought sandwiches that got eaten in the first hour. The rest shared whatever scraps other families could spare. But here's the thing that official records rarely mention. Many evacuation plans fell apart completely. Trains arrived at rural stations where nobody was expecting them. Village volunteers who had prepared for 50 children suddenly faced 300. Some kids waited on platforms for hours while adults scrambled to figure out who would take them home. Then there were the separations that nobody planned for. Brothers and sisters got split up when families ran out of room, or when one child got sick and couldn't travel. Tommy Morrison from Liverpool spent 3 years thinking his younger sister had died in the bombing, only to discover she'd been living just 30 miles away with a different family. The paperwork was so chaotic that reuniting families after the war sometimes took months or even years. The countryside wasn't exactly prepared for this sudden invasion of city children either. Rural families found themselves caring for kids who had never seen a cow, didn't know how to pump water from a well, and were terrified of the dark silence that replaced the familiar sounds of traffic and neighbors. Some country folk were incredibly kind, treating evacuees like their own children. Others saw them as unwelcome burdens who ate too much and complained constantly. Food became a major source of tension. City kids were used to corner shops and regular meals, while their new guardians often lived on simple farm food and strict ratios. Many evacuees wrote letters home begging to return, describing meals of thin porridge and vegetables they'd never heard of. Some families genuinely couldn't afford to feed extra mouths but took children anyway out of patriotic duty. What's remarkable is how quickly children adapted when they had to. Kids who had never left their urban neighborhoods learned to milk cows, collect eggs, and navigate country roads in complete darkness. They developed new games, made friends with local children who spoke with unfamiliar accents, and created their own small communities within their temporary homes. The most heartbreaking part was how possessions became lifelines to their old lives. A worn teddy bear or a family photograph tucked into a coat pocket could mean the difference between a child who adjusted and one who cried themselves to sleep every night. Parents had to make impossible choices about what their children could take: practical clothes and shoes, or the comfort items that might help them feel less alone. Letters became precious beyond measure. Children who could barely write learned to compose detailed updates about their new lives, while parents struggled to sound cheerful and confident in their responses. The mail system, already strained by wartime demands, carried millions of these emotional lifelines between scattered families. Some evacuation stories had surprisingly positive outcomes. City children discovered they loved farm life, while rural families found their homes felt empty when their temporary charges eventually returned home. Lifelong friendships formed between kids from completely different backgrounds, and many evacuees kept in touch with their wartime guardians for decades. Others weren't so fortunate. Children placed with harsh or neglectful families suffered in silence, too young to advocate for themselves and too far from home to get help. Some ran away and tried to walk back to their bombed cities, sleeping in fields and begging for food along the way. The psychological impact of these mass evacuations shaped an entire generation. Children learned early that safety was temporary, that families could be torn apart without warning, and that home might not exist when you returned to look for it. Yet somehow most of these displaced children found ways to survive and even thrive in their temporary homes. Their resilience would serve them well, because the challenges of evacuation were just the beginning of what the war would demand from ordinary families. But while children struggled to adapt to unfamiliar countryside homes, their mothers faced an entirely different set of impossible challenges back in the cities and towns they'd left behind. When the men packed their bags and marched off to war, something extraordinary happened back home. Women who had spent their lives cooking dinner and tending gardens suddenly found themselves running entire farms, factories, and families. The transformation wasn't gradual, it happened overnight. Sarah Mitchell had never operated a tractor in her life. Her husband Tom always handled the heavy machinery while she managed the house and their 3 children. But when Tom's draft notice arrived in March 1942, Sarah had exactly 2 weeks to learn everything about running their 200-acre wheat farm in Kansas. The neighbors helped, sure, but they had their own problems. Their men were leaving too. What's remarkable is how quickly these women adapted. Within months, Sarah was not only operating the tractor but fixing it when it broke down. She learned to read weather patterns, negotiate grain prices, and manage seasonal workers. Her hands, once soft from household duties, became calloused and strong. The children helped after school, but the real burden fell on her shoulders. Then there's the story of Margaret O'Brien in London. When her husband shipped out with the Royal Navy, She was left with 4 children under the age of 10 and a neighborhood full of elderly residents who couldn't care for themselves during air raids. Margaret didn't just survive the Blitz, she became the unofficial leader of her entire street. Every evening Margaret would make rounds to check on her neighbors. She organized the nightly trips to the underground stations, making sure everyone had blankets and whatever food could be scrounged together. When Mrs. Henderson from number 42 broke her hip during a particularly violent bombing run, Margaret moved the elderly woman into her own home. She was already feeding 6 people on rations meant for 4. What was one more mouth? The weird part is how these women found strength they never knew they had. Margaret learned basic first aid from a Red Cross pamphlet. When young Tommy Fletcher got cut by flying glass during a raid, she stitched him up right there in the subway tunnel using thread from her sewing kit. Her hands didn't shake once. But let's not forget the farmers' wives across America who suddenly became agricultural experts. Mary Chen in California's Central Valley had to learn everything about her family's vegetable farm when her husband was sent to fight in the Pacific. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. While Japanese-American families were being forced into internment camps, Mary was growing food to feed the very soldiers fighting Japan. Mary worked 18-hour days during harvest season. She hired local teenagers and elderly men who couldn't enlist, teaching them skills she'd learned just months before. The farm didn't just survive without her husband, it actually produced more vegetables than it had the previous year. Makes sense, right? When your family's survival depends on your success, you find ways to succeed. Meanwhile, in small towns across Europe, women were performing medical procedures they'd learned from watching the village doctor. When professional medical help became scarce, these mothers became the town's unofficial nurses, midwives, and sometimes even surgeons for minor procedures. Rosa Benedetti in rural Italy delivered 12 babies during the war years, including 2 during air raids. The baking tradition became something deeper than just making bread. Women would gather in kitchens, sharing whatever flour and yeast they could find. These weren't just cooking sessions, they were strategy meetings. While their hands worked the dough, they discussed everything from hiding food supplies to helping families evacuate. The rhythm of kneading bread became a form of meditation, a way to stay calm when everything else was chaos. Well, the support networks these women built were incredible. In Liverpool, a group of mothers organized a system where they rotated childcare duties so each woman could work part-time in the munitions factory. They created their own informal school when the official one closed, teaching children in living rooms and church basements. When one family lost their home to bombing, the entire network contributed furniture, clothes, and food without being asked. And the weird part is how they managed to maintain some sense of normalcy for their children. Despite rationing, many mothers found creative ways to celebrate birthdays and holidays. They made toys from scraps, organized games that could be played in bomb shelters, and somehow always managed to make their children feel safe, even when the world was falling apart around them. These women didn't have time to think about whether they were capable of handling such enormous responsibilities. They simply handled them, because the alternative was unthinkable. Their strength came not from some grand heroic vision, but from the simple determination to keep their families alive one day at a time. While mothers held everything together on the home front, other families faced an entirely different kind of terror. Some found themselves with no choice but to disappear completely. The mothers who learned first aid and baked bread to calm their nerves weren't the only ones showing incredible strength during the war. Jewish families across Europe were making impossible choices every single day: hide or run, trust a stranger or risk it alone, stay together or split up to improve the odds. When the Nazis began their systematic hunt, entire families had to vanish from normal life overnight. One day you're sleeping in your own bed, the next you're crammed into a space barely big enough for a coffin. Attics became bedrooms. Basements turned into schools where children learned to whisper their multiplication tables. Barns housed entire extended families who couldn't make a sound when farmers came to feed the animals above their heads. The hiding spots were everywhere and nowhere at the same time: behind false walls in Amsterdam, under floorboards in Polish farmhouses, in root cellars that reeked of rotting vegetables. Some families spent months in spaces so small they couldn't stand up straight. Others moved from place to place every few weeks, like a deadly game of musical chairs where losing meant death. But here's what really gets you mid-tea. The children had to become adults instantly. 8-year-olds learned that coughing at the wrong moment could kill their entire family. Kids who used to run around playgrounds now practiced staying perfectly still for 6 hours at a time. They played silent games with their fingers and learned to communicate through eye movements alone. The helpers, and thank goodness there were helpers, risked everything. A baker in France might hide a family above his shop, knowing that discovery meant execution for everyone involved. Dutch families took in Jewish children and raised them as their own. Polish farmers dug hidden rooms under their kitchens, then acted completely normal when German soldiers came looking for eggs and milk. Food became an impossible puzzle. How do you feed extra people when everyone's already starving? Helpers would sneak scraps at night, climbing ladders to attics with bowls of watery soup. Sometimes they'd pretend to throw food scraps to chickens, but really they were feeding the family hidden in the barn. The portions were tiny, maybe half a slice of bread and some thin broth, but it kept people alive another day. The codes and signals were straight out of a spy movie, except the stakes were real lives. A flower pot on a windowsill might mean all clear. Moving a curtain a certain way could signal soldiers coming. In Warsaw, resistance fighters developed hand signals so complex they could have entire conversations without making a sound. Children became masters at reading these signals because their survival depended on it. And the weird part is how creative people got with hiding places. Families hid behind bookcases that swung open like doors. Others built secret rooms behind fireplaces. Some lived in spaces between walls that were so narrow they had to enter sideways. A few families even hid in old wells, climbing down during the day and coming up only at night for fresh air. The psychological toll was devastating. Imagine trying to keep a 2-year-old quiet when soldiers are searching the house below. Parents would cover their children's mouths, knowing that one cry could doom them all. Some families gave their babies small amounts of alcohol or medicine to keep them sleepy during dangerous hours. Others sent their children away to strangers, hoping never to see them again if it meant the kids would survive. Weather became another enemy. Winter hiding places were freezing cold, but lighting a fire might give away your location through smoke. Summer attics turned into ovens where people could barely breathe. Rain was both a blessing and a curse. It covered noise but also leaked into hiding spots, creating miserable, moldy conditions that bred disease. Trust was the most dangerous luxury of all. Every person who knew about a hiding place was a potential death sentence. Sometimes neighbors would turn in hidden families for a reward, maybe some extra food or money. Other times, people who had helped for months would suddenly get scared and force families to leave with nowhere else to go. The children who survived these hiding places remember strange details. The smell of onions that always seemed to hang in the air, the way sunlight looked different when you only saw it through cracks in walls, the sound of normal life continuing outside while you lived like a ghost. These kids learned that staying alive meant becoming invisible, and many spent years after the war trying to remember how to take up space in the world again. Most hiding places lasted only months before someone informed on them, or they were discovered during routine searches. The families that survived had incredible luck, but they also had helpers who never gave up on them. Even the best hiding places couldn't last forever though. Winter was coming, and with it, new challenges that would test every family's will to survive in ways they never could have imagined. The hiding spots that kept families alive during air raids became death traps. When winter arrived, underground shelters that once felt safe now turned into frozen caves where breath formed clouds and fingers went numb around thin blankets. Snow piled up outside while families huddled below ground for weeks at a time. Children learned to sleep wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Mothers wrapped babies in newspaper when actual blankets ran out. The lucky ones had candles, but most sat in complete darkness to avoid attracting attention from patrols above. Food became more precious than gold during these brutal months. Bread recipes changed dramatically when wheat disappeared from stores. Bakers mixed sawdust, potato peels, and whatever else they could find into loaves that barely resembled real food. People ate it anyway because empty stomachs hurt more than strange tastes. Then there were the shoes. Leather boots wore out fast, and no new ones were being made for civilians. Wooden clogs became the norm across occupied Europe. Kids clomped to school in carved blocks that gave them splinters and blisters. The sound echoed through empty streets like horse hooves on cobblestone. Makes sense that black markets started popping up everywhere, right? Secret trading networks developed in bombed-out buildings and abandoned warehouses. A single egg might cost a week's wages. Sugar was worth more than jewelry. People traded family heirlooms for a cup of real coffee or a piece of actual meat. Frostbite became as common as scraped knees had been before the war. Children's fingers turned white, then purple, then black at the tips. Parents learned to recognize the warning signs and massage frozen limbs back to life. Some weren't so lucky. Hospital records from that winter show thousands of amputations from severe cold exposure. The weird part is how creative people got with staying warm. Families burned furniture, books, and even floorboards to keep fires going. Old newspapers became insulation stuffed between layers of clothing. Some people slept in groups just to share body heat, crowding together like penguins in a storm. But hunger was the real killer during those freezing months. Soup kitchens served watery broths made from boiled bones and scraps of vegetables. Lucky families might find a single potato to stretch across 3 meals. Children learned to make dandelion salad and nettle soup taste like delicacies through pure imagination and desperate need. Well, the soldiers had it even worse than civilians in many ways. Troops fighting on the Eastern Front faced temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Their uniforms weren't designed for Arctic conditions. Many wrapped themselves in whatever they could find, from abandoned houses, curtains, rugs, even women's coats over their military gear. Supply lines broke down completely during the worst storms. Food deliveries stopped reaching isolated units for weeks at a time. Soldiers ate bark soup, boiled leather belts, and anything else that might contain nutrients. Some units lost more men to starvation and freezing than to enemy bullets. Letters home from that period tell incredible stories of survival. One British soldier wrote about sharing a single can of beans among 12 men on Christmas Day. A German mother described feeding her 3 children nothing but watered-down milk for 5 straight days. These weren't dramatic exaggerations, they were typical experiences across war-torn Europe. Let's not forget how ingenious people became at finding food sources. City dwellers dug up flower beds to plant turnips and cabbages. Children learned to identify which tree barks could be ground into flour substitutes. Rooftop gardens appeared overnight as people realized every inch of soil was precious. Urban hunting became a real thing too. Pigeons, rats, and even cats ended up in cooking pots when traditional meat disappeared completely. Recipe books from that era include instructions for preparing animals that peacetime cooks would never consider touching. Desperate times called for desperate meals. The rich weren't immune to these hardships either. Wealthy families who once threw elaborate dinner parties now stood in the same breadlines as factory workers. Money meant nothing when there was simply nothing to buy. Social classes blurred when everyone faced the same empty shelves and growling stomachs. Spring couldn't come fast enough for anyone who survived that brutal winter, but even warmer weather brought new challenges. The same hiding places that protected families from bombs and cold would soon become staging grounds for even more dangerous survival situations. People who thought they'd learned everything about staying alive were about to discover that winter's hardships were just preparation for what came next. The war was far from over, and those who made it through the frozen months had developed skills they'd need for the trials ahead. Nobody prepares you for the moment when everything goes quiet. One minute you're flying a mission over enemy territory, the next you're hanging from a parachute watching your plane spiral down in flames. For thousands of Allied airmen that silence meant one thing: capture was coming. Getting shot down was just the beginning of a completely different war. Fighter pilot John Sterling remembers the eerie calm after bailing out over Germany in 1943. The countryside looked so peaceful from up there, he later wrote. Then I hit the ground and reality kicked in. Within hours, German soldiers surrounded him. His war as a pilot was over. His war as a prisoner was just starting. The journey to prisoner of war camps often took days by cattle car. Dozens of men crammed into spaces meant for livestock. No food, little water, and definitely no bathroom breaks. Some guys passed out from the heat. Others whispered jokes to keep spirits up, though nobody felt much like laughing. Stalag Luft III housed about 10,000 Allied airmen at its peak. The camp stretched across sandy ground in Poland, surrounded by double fences and guard towers. Every wooden barracks looked identical on purpose. The Germans wanted prisoners to feel lost and hopeless. But here's the thing about pilots: they're used to navigating by landmarks. They started making their own. Daily life followed strict routines designed to break spirits. Wake-up calls at dawn, followed by roll call that lasted hours. Guards counted every prisoner twice, sometimes 3 times. The Germans were obsessed with numbers, probably because escapes happened more often than they cared to admit. Smart prisoners learned to make these counts take even longer by accidentally standing in wrong spots. Food became an obsession for obvious reasons. Breakfast might consist of ersatz coffee, basically burnt grain that tasted like dirt mixed with water. Lunch brought thin soup with maybe a few potato peels floating around. The evening meal was often just black bread that felt more like cardboard. Red Cross packages saved lives when they arrived, but those shipments were unpredictable. Then there's the ingenious ways prisoners fought back. They couldn't exactly stage uprisings, but they could drive guards absolutely crazy with small acts of defiance. Some guys learned German just so they could understand orders, then pretend not to speak the language. Others developed elaborate ways to steal extra food during meal distribution. The guards knew what was happening but couldn't prove anything specific. Letters home required careful coding since censors read everything. Prisoners developed systems where certain words meant completely different things. The weather has been terrible might actually mean planning something big soon. Families back home often had no idea their loved ones were sending secret messages about escape plans or camp conditions. Medical care was practically non-existent. Camp doctors were often prisoners themselves trying to help with almost no supplies. Broken bones were set with makeshift splints. Infections spread quickly in overcrowded barracks where dozens of men shared the same sleeping space. Dysentery became so common that prisoners just accepted it as part of daily life. Winter brought special miseries that nobody anticipated. Wooden barracks offered little protection against Polish cold that could drop below zero for months. Prisoners stuffed newspaper in their clothes for insulation. Some mornings water froze solid in cups next to their beds. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, but the camp medical supplies couldn't handle those injuries properly. But human creativity finds ways to shine even in the darkest places. Prisoners organized lectures on everything from engineering to literature. Some guys who'd never touched an instrument learned to play makeshift guitars built from scrap wood. Others wrote entire novels in their heads, memorizing every chapter since paper was scarce. The psychological games between guards and prisoners never stopped. German officers tried to recruit informants by offering better food or warmer clothing. Most prisoners saw right through these attempts. But desperation made some men consider deals they'd never make under normal circumstances. Trust became complicated when survival was at stake. Escape attempts were constant, despite brutal punishments for those caught trying. The famous tunnel system at Stalag Luft 3 took over a year to dig, with prisoners working in shifts around the clock. They scattered dirt from the tunnels in their pockets, spreading it around the camp during exercise periods. Guards never figured out where all that sand was coming from. News from the outside world came through hidden radios and new prisoners arriving with fresh information. Every rumor about Allied advances got passed along in whispered conversations during mealtimes or exercise periods. Hope was sometimes the only thing keeping men alive from one day to the next. What nobody talks about enough is how these experiences changed men forever. They learned that survival often depended more on mental toughness than physical strength. But even the toughest prisoners had breaking points, and reaching those limits taught them things about themselves they never wanted to know. The war wasn't just happening on battlefields anymore. It was happening in every cramped barracks where men dreamed of freedom while planning their next small act of defiance. When most people think of daring wartime rescues, they picture fighter planes swooping down or submarines surfacing in enemy waters. But deep in the jungles of Burma, the most unlikely heroes had 4 legs, enormous ears, and could carry a full-grown man on their backs. These gentle giants would soon become the difference between life and death for hundreds of stranded refugees. The year was 1942, and Japanese forces were sweeping through Burma like wildfire. British tea planters, Indian families, and anyone connected to the colonial government found themselves trapped between advancing enemy troops and some of the world's most unforgiving jungle terrain. Roads had turned into rivers of mud. Bridges were blown apart, and the monsoon rains made every step a battle against nature itself. Enter Giles Mackerel, a British tea planter who looked more like a mild-mannered accountant than a jungle rescue hero. This quiet man wore wire-rimmed glasses and spoke in measured tones, but when desperate refugees began arriving at his tea plantation with stories of thousands more trapped in the jungle, Mackerel did something that seemed completely insane. He decided to organize a rescue mission using the most unconventional transportation available, elephants. The refugees weren't just facing enemy soldiers. Leeches dropped from trees and latched onto anything warm-blooded that passed underneath. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick they blocked out sunlight. Wild animals stalked through the underbrush, and the jungle paths had become treacherous swamps where a single wrong step could mean disappearing forever into quicksand or drowning in flash floods. Mackerel knew that ordinary vehicles would be useless in these conditions. Trucks got stuck in mud within minutes. Horses couldn't handle the terrain. Even experienced jungle guides were getting lost in the maze of flooded valleys and fallen trees. But elephants, these magnificent creatures had been navigating Burma's jungles for thousands of years. They could walk through water up to their bellies, push aside massive fallen logs, and instinctively find stable ground where humans saw only swamp. The first challenge was finding enough elephants willing to make the dangerous journey. Mackerel reached out to local Burmese elephant handlers, called Mahalts, who had worked with these animals their entire lives. These Mahalts understood elephant behavior better than most people understand their own pets. They could tell when an elephant was nervous, tired, or sensing danger ahead. More importantly, they knew how to keep these massive animals calm in the chaos of war. But convincing the elephants to venture into the most dangerous parts of the jungle took time. Elephants are incredibly intelligent animals. They can sense fear and danger in ways humans never could. The rescue elephants had to trust their Mahalts completely before they would wade through crocodile-infested rivers or navigate around unexploded bombs scattered throughout the forest. The actual rescue operations were like something out of an adventure movie, except the stakes were absolutely real. Mackerel and his elephant teams would trek for days through jungle so dense that noon looked like twilight. They followed crude maps drawn by refugees who had barely escaped with their lives. Sometimes they found groups of starving families huddled around dying campfires. Other times they discovered lone survivors who had been wandering lost for weeks. Loading exhausted, sick refugees onto elephants required incredible skill from the Mahalts. These weren't trained circus elephants performing tricks for crowds. They were working animals dealing with unfamiliar sounds, smells, and the stress of carrying people who were often delirious from hunger and fever. Yet somehow the elephants seemed to understand their mission. They moved carefully when carrying children, stopped frequently to let sick passengers rest, and navigated around dangerous terrain with remarkable precision. Local tribal groups became crucial allies in these rescue operations. They knew secret paths through the jungle that didn't appear on any military maps. They could predict which rivers would flood and which valleys offered safe passage. These tribal guides worked alongside the elephant teams, often serving as advanced scouts who located refugee groups and determined the safest routes for extraction. The rescued refugees often described the moment they first saw elephants approaching through the jungle mist as almost magical. After days or weeks of believing they would die alone in the wilderness, these massive, gentle creatures represented salvation itself. Children who had been too weak to walk suddenly found themselves riding high above the jungle canopy, seeing hope for the first time in weeks. Weather conditions made every rescue mission a race against time. Monsoon rains could turn a navigable stream into a raging torrent within hours. What seemed like solid ground in the morning might become an impassable swamp by afternoon. The elephant teams had to move fast, but also carefully, knowing that one mistake could trap them in the same deadly conditions they were trying to help others escape. But even as Mackerel's elephant rescue teams saved hundreds of lives in Burma, another kind of childhood was vanishing across the globe, where students found their classrooms transformed into something completely unrecognizable. When the war started, Tommy Fletcher was 8 years old and absolutely terrible at arithmetic. His teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had been drilling multiplication tables into reluctant young minds for 15 years. But by October 1940, Mrs. Henderson was gone. So was Mr. Davies, the headmaster, and Miss Cooper, who taught geography. They'd all been drafted or volunteered for war work, leaving behind empty classrooms and confused children who suddenly had nowhere to go during the day. Across Britain, nearly half of all schools simply shut their doors. The government needed every able-bodied adult for the war effort, and teachers weren't exempt from duty. What's the point of teaching children about fractions when the country might not exist next month? Priorities shifted overnight. Parents found themselves explaining why school was cancelled indefinitely while bombs fell in the distance. But here's the thing about kids, they're remarkably adaptable. When formal education disappeared, informal learning took its place in the most unexpected locations. Tommy and his friends started attending school in Farmer McLeod's barn, where Mrs. Whitman, a retired teacher too old for military service, gathered whoever showed up. She taught reading using newspaper headlines about the war, which made lessons feel urgent and real. Geography became a study of battle maps spread across hay bales. Then there were the practical lessons that no peacetime curriculum ever covered. Children learned to identify different airplane engines by sound alone. German Heinkel bombers made a distinctive droning noise, while British Spitfires had a higher-pitched whine. Getting this wrong could mean the difference between waving at a plane and diving for cover. Schools that remained open turned aircraft recognition into a daily quiz. Kids became experts at spotting enemy silhouettes against cloudy skies. Homework took on new meaning when electric lights were forbidden after sunset. Blackout regulations meant completing assignments by candlelight or oil lamps, which sounds romantic until you've tried to solve long division while squinting at flickering shadows. Children developed remarkable night vision and learned to write in near darkness. Some families couldn't afford candles, so kids did their reading by firelight or simply gave up on evening study altogether. Let's not forget that traditional playgrounds became dangerous places almost overnight. Swing sets and slides were removed to be melted down for metal to build aircraft. In their place stood piles of rubble from bombed buildings, unexploded ordnance, and hastily constructed air raid shelters. Children learned new games that would have horrified their parents just months earlier. Bomb dodging involved running between craters while pretending to avoid falling shrapnel. Kids collected pieces of destroyed German planes as trophies, not understanding they might be handling dangerous materials. The strangest part was how quickly children adapted these deadly serious games into their daily routine. Playing air raid became as normal as playing tag used to be. One child would serve as the lookout, scanning the sky for imaginary bombers. When they shouted incoming, everyone had to find shelter within seconds. The kid who took longest to reach safety was dead and out of the game. Dark humor, but it taught survival skills that actually saved lives. Mathematical lessons got a wartime makeover too. Instead of calculating how many apples Johnny had after giving away 3, children learned to divide food rations among family members. If mother gets 4 ounces of butter per week and father gets 6, how much does each person get per day? These weren't abstract word problems. Getting the math wrong meant someone went hungry. Reading lessons relied heavily on government pamphlets about gas mask care, first aid procedures, and how to identify different types of bombs. Children became fluent in wartime vocabulary that their parents struggled to pronounce. Words like incendiary, shrapnel, and evacuation rolled off young tongues with disturbing ease. Libraries were destroyed or converted to civil defense headquarters, so kids read whatever survived: comic books about brave soldiers, adventure stories set in far-off places, and propaganda leaflets disguised as entertainment. Some lessons happened whether adults planned them or not. Children developed an intuitive understanding of human psychology by watching how people reacted under pressure. They learned to read faces and voices, detecting fear or hope in the subtlest expressions. These skills proved invaluable for navigating the complex social dynamics of wartime communities where trust could mean survival. The most important lesson was flexibility. Plans changed without warning. Today's classroom might be tomorrow's morgue or ammunition depot. Children who once threw tantrums over minor schedule changes learned to pack up and move at a moment's notice. Education continued, just not in the orderly, predictable way anyone had expected. While children were mastering these survival skills in makeshift classrooms, their mothers faced challenges that would reshape entire societies. Women were about to discover strength they never knew they possessed, taking on roles that would forever change what it meant to be the heart of a family during wartime. The bombs were falling, factories were burning, and suddenly something unprecedented happened. Women stepped into roles that had been forbidden to them for centuries, not because society finally decided to be fair, but because there was literally no one else left to do the job. Over 400,000 American women joined the military during World War II. That's more than the entire population of some states at the time. But here's what's wild about that number. It doesn't even scratch the surface of how many women actually fought this war. For every woman in uniform, there were dozens more building planes, cracking codes, driving ambulances through bombing raids, and keeping entire nations from collapsing. The Soviet Union took this further than anyone else dared. While other countries debated whether women could handle combat, the Soviets handed them fighter planes and said good luck. The Night Witches became legendary, female pilots who flew bombing missions in flimsy canvas planes that were so quiet, German soldiers only heard them when bombs started exploding. These women flew multiple missions every single night, sometimes 20 or 30 runs before dawn. Their planes had no radios, no parachutes, and barely any armor. Yet they terrified one of the most powerful armies in the world. Then there were the factory workers who completely transformed how wars were won. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol, but the reality was even more impressive than the poster. Women were building B-24 bombers in plants that ran 24 hours a day. They welded ship hulls, assembled machine guns, and manufactured the ammunition that would ultimately win the war. Some of these factories were so efficient that they were producing a new aircraft every hour. The weird part is how quickly everyone adapted to these changes. One day, flying a bomber was considered too dangerous and complicated for women. The next day, women were delivering brand new aircraft from factories to military bases across entire continents. The women Air Force service pilots flew every type of plane the military had, including experimental jets that male pilots sometimes refused to test. Let's not forget the intelligence work happening behind the scenes. Bletchley Park, where the British cracked the Enigma code, employed thousands of women who were doing mathematical calculations that most university professors couldn't handle. These weren't just secretaries taking notes. They were analyzing German communication patterns, predicting submarine movements, and literally shortening the war by years through pure brainpower. Medical work became another area where women proved themselves under impossible conditions. Army nurses found themselves performing surgery in bombed-out hospitals with no electricity. They worked 18-hour shifts while air raids shook the walls around them. Some nurses parachuted into occupied territory to treat wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated. Others served on hospital ships that were deliberately targeted by enemy submarines. But here's something that often gets overlooked. Women were also running entire countries while their governments focused on military strategy. They managed food distribution, organized evacuation plans, and kept schools and hospitals functioning during the worst bombing campaigns in history. British women coordinated the evacuation of over 3 million children from London. That's logistics on a scale that most generals would find overwhelming. The resistance movements across occupied Europe relied heavily on women for one simple reason: they attracted less suspicion. A woman carrying a basket of vegetables could smuggle weapons, coded messages, and even radio equipment right past German checkpoints. Female couriers traveled hundreds of miles through enemy territory, memorizing information that could save or doom entire underground networks. Agricultural work transformed completely as well. Before the war, farming was considered men's work that required too much physical strength for women. During the war, women operated tractors, harvested crops, and managed livestock across millions of acres. The Women's Land Army in Britain kept the country fed, while German submarines were sinking supply ships faster than they could be replaced. What makes all of this even more remarkable is how quickly these changes were reversed after the war ended. Women who had been building fighter planes were suddenly told that operating a cash register might be too complicated for them. Pilots who had flown across oceans were informed that driving a taxi wasn't appropriate work for ladies. The same society that had depended on women's capabilities for survival suddenly developed amnesia about what they had witnessed. Old gender roles had been completely shattered by necessity, then hastily glued back together when the emergency passed. But something fundamental had shifted that couldn't be entirely erased. The war had proven that limitations people believed were biological were actually just social conventions that crumbled the moment survival was at stake. And while the world tried to pretend nothing had changed, everyone knew better. Meanwhile, across Europe and the Pacific, families were learning that survival often came down to seconds and split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. The screaming siren could hit you anywhere: middle of dinner, halfway through putting on your shoes, or right when you finally dozed off after 3 sleepless nights. When that wailing sound pierced the air, you had maybe 30 seconds before the first bombs started falling. 30 seconds to grab whatever you could and dive for cover. Most families kept a bag ready by the door: flashlight, water, maybe some crackers if they were lucky enough to have any. But panic makes people forget everything they planned. Mrs. Henderson from Liverpool later told her grandchildren how she grabbed her husband's shaving cream instead of the emergency supplies during one particularly terrifying raid. Her neighbor ran out clutching a single shoe. Makes sense, right? Terror doesn't leave much room for logical thinking. The lucky ones had cellars, stone walls, thick enough to muffle the explosions overhead. Families would pile down there with blankets, candles, and whatever food they could grab. Some people spent entire weeks underground when the bombing got really intense. They'd emerge blinking like moles, covered in dust, wondering if their street still existed. Then there were the unlucky ones: no cellar, no basement, just thin wooden floors between them and death. These families had to get creative fast. Kitchen tables became bomb shelters. Bathtubs turned into protective caves. People learned to spot the difference between a whistle that meant danger and one that meant you had about 5 more seconds to live. Firefighters became the real heroes of these raids. While everyone else ran towards safety, they ran straight into the flames. Houses exploded around them, walls collapsed without warning, and they kept going. Some of them were just teenagers, barely old enough to shave, hauling water hoses through streets filled with burning debris. They'd work 18-hour shifts, catch a few minutes of sleep in a doorway, then get back to fighting fires when the next wave of bombers arrived. The timing was everything. Bomb disposal experts developed an almost supernatural sense for when buildings were about to collapse. They could hear the creak of weakening beams, smell the smoke that meant fire was spreading behind walls. One wrong step, 1 second too slow, and that was it. But they kept going anyway, because someone had to. Children adapted faster than anyone expected. Kids who had been afraid of thunderstorms 6 months earlier now slept through explosions that shook entire neighborhoods. They invented games around the bombing schedules, racing to see who could get to the shelter. Fastest became the new playground competition. Some even learned to identify different types of aircraft by sound alone, a useful skill when knowing whether those engines belonged to your side or theirs could save your life. Underground living created its own strange world. Families who had never spoken to their neighbors suddenly knew everything about each other's lives. Mrs. O'Brien's snoring, the baby who cried every night at exactly 2 in the morning, the old man who told the same war story from 1918 over and over again. Privacy became a luxury nobody could afford. The weird part is how people found ways to keep living normal lives between the terror. Mothers still tried to cook dinner, even if it meant serving it in a bomb shelter. Teachers held lessons in basements, using candlelight to read from water-damaged books. Kids still played with their toys, though many games now involved building pretend air raid shelters for dolls. Food became even more precious during raids. Imagine finally getting your hands on a piece of real meat, only to have the sirens go off before you could take a bite. Families learned to eat fast or carry their meals down to the cellar with them. Cold soup tastes a lot better when you're still alive to drink it. Some people pushed their luck too far. They'd hear the sirens but decide to finish whatever they were doing first. Just 5 more minutes to complete a repair job, or grab one more valuable item from upstairs. Rescue workers found plenty of bodies clutching photograph albums or jewelry boxes. The difference between life and death often came down to choosing correctly between what you wanted and what you needed. Medical teams worked miracles with almost nothing. No proper hospitals, limited supplies, and patients arriving covered in dust and blood. Nurses learned to perform surgery by candlelight, using kitchen tables as operating rooms. They saved lives with bandages made from torn sheets and alcohol meant for cleaning wounds used as anesthetic. The lucky timing stories became neighborhood legends. The family who left their house 2 minutes before a direct hit flattened it completely. The man who got called into work early and returned to find a crater where his bedroom used to be. But even the closest calls couldn't prepare people for what happened when entire communities tried to flee at once. The roads filled with desperate families, all heading towards safety that might not even exist. During wartime, your neighbor could become your worst enemy without warning. Trust turned into the most dangerous luxury anyone could afford. Martha Klein thought she knew Mrs. Hoffman well. They had shared coffee for 3 years, complained about rising bread prices, even watched each other's children. But when the Gestapo knocked on Martha's door at dawn, dragging away her Jewish husband, Mrs. Hoffman stood at her window with crossed arms and a satisfied nod. The reward money was apparently worth more than friendship. This betrayal wasn't unique. Across occupied Europe, people discovered that survival sometimes meant choosing between saving themselves or saving others. Fear makes monsters out of ordinary folks faster than you might think. Children learned to read faces like spies. Was the grocer's smile genuine, or was he memorizing who bought extra food? Did the mailman linger too long near certain houses? Even playmates became suspects when parents whispered warnings about loose tongues. The Rosenberg family in Amsterdam thought their downstairs neighbor was sympathetic. He always nodded politely, never asked uncomfortable questions about the extra footsteps upstairs. For 8 months they felt relatively safe. Then came the night when jackboots stomped up their stairs, guided by someone who knew exactly which floorboards creaked and which walls were thin. But here's the weird part. Betrayal wasn't always about hatred or greed. Sometimes people informed on others simply because they panicked. A single mother might report suspicious activity to prove her loyalty and protect her own children. Makes sense, right? When your own family's survival hangs by a thread, moral choices become impossibly complicated. Then there were the codes. Secret languages developed faster than wildfire. A red flower in a window meant safe house. Bread left on a specific shelf indicated danger nearby. Even laundry hanging in certain patterns could warn of approaching patrols. People became walking cipher machines, embedding messages in grocery lists and casual conversations. Anna Kowalski in Poland perfected the art of invisible communication. She would visit the market, seemingly chatting about vegetables while actually coordinating resistance activities. The potatoes look fresh today meant the drop location was secure. I prefer carrots signaled immediate evacuation needed. One wrong word could doom entire networks. Letters home became masterpieces of hidden meaning. Soldiers wrote about weather and food while actually describing troop movements and morale. Censors couldn't catch everything, especially when families developed personal codes based on shared memories. Mentioning Uncle Peter's birthday might indicate a planned offensive, while complaining about mother's cooking could signal ammunition shortages. Well, not everyone chose betrayal. Some neighbors became unlikely heroes, risking everything for people they barely knew. The Dutch family who hid Jewish refugees for 2 years never asked for payment or recognition. They simply couldn't stand by, while innocent people faced extermination. Their reward: constant terror and sleepless nights, wondering if today would bring discovery. Underground networks relied entirely on trust between strangers. Resistance fighters would knock on random doors, hoping to find sympathetic ears rather than Nazi collaborators. One wrong guess meant torture and death, not just for themselves but for everyone they might name under interrogation. Children became the most reliable messengers precisely because adults underestimated them. 10-year-old Pierre could walk past German checkpoints carrying coded drawings that looked like schoolwork. His innocent face and casual manner never raised suspicion, even though he was coordinating sabotage operations across occupied France. The psychological toll was enormous. People stopped trusting their instincts about human nature. If your childhood friend could become an informant, how could you ever feel safe again? Paranoia became a survival skill, not a mental illness. Some families developed elaborate testing procedures for potential allies. They would share false information with different people, then wait to see which version reached enemy ears. This process could take months, during which time they remained vulnerable and isolated. Churches presented particularly complex situations. Priests and ministers wanted to help persecuted people, but congregations included potential informants. Some clergy developed signals using hymn selections and sermon topics. Others created secret networks within their communities, carefully vetting each member over extended periods. And the weird part is, after the war ended, many communities never fully recovered from these betrayals. People who had informed on neighbors often continued living in the same towns, creating permanent underlying tensions. Some families maintained grudges for generations, while others chose forgiveness as their path to healing. The most heartbreaking cases involved children who didn't understand the implications of their words. A 6-year-old might innocently mention the quiet people hiding in their basement, not realizing this casual comment could lead to mass arrests. Parents lived in constant fear of their own children's honesty, but even in this atmosphere of suspicion and fear, genuine trust still flourished in unexpected places. When people did find reliable allies, those bonds became stronger than family ties. Shared danger created unbreakable connections that lasted lifetimes. However, as devastating as betrayal could be, nothing compared to what awaited those who were caught and forced into the nightmare of imprisonment and death marches. As bad as prison camps were, things could get much worse. When the war started turning against Germany, prisoners faced something that made their camps look like vacation resorts. They were about to be forced on marches that would kill more people than the bombs ever did. Picture thousands of prisoners, already starving and weak, being told they had to walk hundreds of miles in the middle of winter. No buses, no trains, just their worn-out feet and whatever clothes they could layer on their backs. The guards didn't care if you were sick, injured, or could barely stand. You walked, or you died where you fell. These became known as death marches, and the name wasn't an exaggeration. Guards would wake prisoners at 3 in the morning, and force them to start walking before dawn. Some marches covered over 400 miles. That's like walking from New York to Boston, except you're already half dead from hunger, and it's freezing cold. The worst part, nobody told them where they were going. Prisoners would walk for weeks without knowing if they'd ever reach a destination, or just keep walking until they collapsed. Guards would sometimes change direction randomly, making the march even longer. Makes you wonder if they had any plan at all. Right. Food became almost mythical during these marches. A single piece of bread had to last 3 days. Prisoners would hide tiny crumbs in their pockets, like they were saving diamonds. Some ate grass, tree bark, or anything they could find along the roads. Others shared their last bite with someone weaker, knowing they might not survive another day themselves. Water was even harder to find than food. Guards rarely allowed stops at wells or streams. Prisoners would scoop up handfuls of dirty snow, or drink from puddles when the guards weren't looking. Dysentery spread like wildfire through the marching columns, making the already impossible journey even more brutal. Then there were the shoes. Most prisoners had been wearing the same pair for months or years in the camps. The leather had cracked, the soles had holes, and many were held together with strips of cloth or wire. Some prisoners wrapped their feet in newspaper, or rags torn from their clothes. Others walked barefoot through snow, leaving bloody footprints on the frozen ground. But here's where human nature gets interesting. Even during these nightmare marches, people found ways to help each other. Stronger prisoners would carry the packs of those who were struggling. Others would help their fellow marchers stay awake during rest stops in freezing weather. Fall asleep in that cold, and you might never wake up. Some prisoners became escape artists during these marches. Guards were tired and cold too, making them less alert than usual. A few prisoners would slip away during snowstorms, or when the column passed through forests. The lucky ones found friendly locals who would hide them until Allied forces arrived. Others wandered for days behind enemy lines, living off whatever they could find. Red Cross packages became legendary during these marches. When prisoners were lucky enough to receive them, a single package might be shared among 10 or 15 people. A can of condensed milk would be mixed with snow to make it last longer. One small bar of chocolate could be divided into pieces so tiny they barely qualified as crumbs. The weird part is how some prisoners kept their spirits up during these impossible conditions. They'd tell jokes, share stories from home, or quietly sing songs to keep their minds off the pain. One group of prisoners created an imaginary restaurant and would spend hours describing elaborate meals they'd cook after the war. Their stomachs were empty, but their imaginations kept them sane. Weather made everything 10 times worse. Winter temperatures dropped so low that prisoners' breath would freeze in their beards. Frostbite was common, and many lost toes or fingers along the way. Some marches happened during spring thaws, turning roads into muddy swamps that sucked shoes right off feet. Either way, the weather was never on their side. Guard behavior varied wildly during these marches. Some were brutal, shooting anyone who couldn't keep up. Others, especially older guards who were tired of the war, would look the other way when prisoners helped each other, or even when some escaped. A few guards would secretly share their own food with prisoners when their officers weren't watching. Communication with the outside world was nearly impossible during these marches. Families had no idea where their loved ones were, or if they were even still alive. Some prisoners would drop notes along the road, hoping local people would find them and somehow get word to their families. Most of these messages were never delivered, but the hope kept people going. What made some people survive these marches while others didn't? Pure luck played a huge role, but survivors often say it was the person walking next to them who made the difference. Someone to talk to, share warmth with, or simply remind you that you weren't alone in the nightmare. The marches eventually ended when Allied forces caught up with the columns, or when Germany finally surrendered. But by then, thousands had already died along the roadsides of Europe. For those who survived, the real battle was just beginning. Finding enough food to rebuild their strength after months of starvation. Empty stomachs made people do crazy things during World War II. Kids who once threw away crusts suddenly fought over them. Adults who used to complain about simple meals now dreamed about bread and butter. Food became more valuable than gold, and everyone knew it. Ration cards turned grocery shopping into a math lesson nobody wanted. Each person got tiny amounts of sugar, meat and butter per week. Families counted every grain of rice. Mothers divided single eggs among 4 children, making sure each got exactly the same amount. One extra spoonful could start a family argument that lasted days. But here's where it gets interesting. People became incredibly creative, with almost nothing. Housewives mixed sawdust into bread dough to make loaves bigger. Sounds disgusting, right? Well, hungry families didn't care about taste when their stomachs were growling. Coffee got replaced with roasted acorns. Tea became hot water with grass or tree bark. Some families made mock everything. Mock apple pie using crackers instead of apples. Mock chicken using vegetables shaped like drumsticks. Gardens popped up everywhere like mushrooms after rain. Front yards became potato patches. City parks got divided into tiny plots where office workers grew cabbage during lunch breaks. Even London's fancy Hyde Park had vegetable rows where flower beds used to be. The British government created a slogan, "Dig for victory." Sounds patriotic, but really it meant grow food or starve. Children learned to forage like medieval peasants. They picked dandelion leaves for salad, gathered nuts that squirrels might have wanted, and searched fields for wild berries. Kids became experts at finding edible weeds that adults had walked past for years. Some got sick eating the wrong plants, but most learned quickly which ones were safe. Then there were the black markets, underground networks where people traded illegal food. A single orange might cost a week's wages. Chocolate bars became currency more valuable than actual money. People risked prison sentences to buy extra butter or sugar. Farmers sometimes hid grain from government inspectors, selling it secretly to desperate city families. Getting caught meant serious jail time, but hunger made people take crazy risks. Soup kitchens became social centers in bombed-out neighborhoods. Long lines of people waiting for thin stew that was mostly water and a few vegetables. But nobody complained about the taste. Free food was free food. Church basements and school cafeterias served hundreds of people daily. Volunteers stirred massive pots with ladles bigger than baseball bats. Protein became the holy grail of wartime eating. Meat disappeared from most tables for months at a time. People ate rabbits, pigeons, and even rats when things got really desperate. In some cities, pets started disappearing. Nobody talked about it, but everyone knew what was happening. Survival makes people do unthinkable things. Rural families had advantages, but not huge ones. They could grow more food, maybe keep a chicken or two hidden from government collectors, but they also had to feed hungry relatives who fled from bombed cities. A farmhouse that once fed 5 people suddenly had 15 mouths to feed. Even farmers went to bed hungry sometimes. Storage became an art form. Families buried jars of preserved vegetables in backyards, hoping bombs wouldn't destroy their hidden food supplies. Root cellars stored potatoes and turnips through harsh winters. Women learned to can everything, even foods that normally stayed fresh. Waste became unthinkable. Potato peels got boiled into soup. Chicken bones got boiled again and again until they turned to powder. Children's birthday parties featured cakes made from mashed carrots and whatever sweetener could be found. Candles were precious, so kids blew out matches instead. Party games included guessing mystery foods while blindfolded, usually vegetables they'd never tasted before the war. Letters home from soldiers often mentioned food more than fighting. They wrote about dreaming of their mother's cooking, remembering Sunday dinners and promising to never waste food again. Packages from home containing cookies or candy got shared among entire military units. One chocolate bar might get divided among 20 men. The weird part is how people adapted their expectations. After months of eating thin soup and stale bread, a simple boiled potato tasted like a feast. Families celebrated finding a single fresh egg like winning the lottery. Kids who had never seen bananas before the war didn't miss them. But adults who remembered pre-war fruit went slightly crazy, craving things that simply didn't exist anymore. Winter made everything worse. Frozen ground meant no fresh vegetables. Stored food ran low by February and March. These months became known as the hunger gap, the time when even careful families started running out of everything. People learned that hunger changes how you think, how you sleep, and how you treat other people. But they also discovered something else about human nature and the lengths people would go to protect the ones they loved. Even when everything seemed hopeless, tiny sparks of light appeared in the darkest places. A smuggled letter, a shared cigarette, a whispered song in a crowded shelter. These moments didn't end the war, but they kept people alive inside. Stories traveled faster than bombs sometimes. Word spread about a Polish officer who escaped from 3 different prisoner camps. Each time, he got caught. Each time, he tried again. Guards started calling him the ghost because he kept vanishing from locked cells. His story reached other camps through smuggled notes, and suddenly prisoners who had given up started planning their own escapes. They figured, if this guy could break out 3 times, maybe they had one good escape in them too. Letters became lifelines, but not the kind you'd expect. Families developed secret codes hidden in ordinary sentences. Aunt Martha's roses are blooming beautifully meant everyone was still alive. The weather has been terrible, warned that soldiers were searching the area. Children learned to read between the lines before they could properly read the lines themselves. The weird part is how music kept breaking through. Air raid shelters turned into underground concert halls. People sang everything from church hymns to silly nursery rhymes. A British woman named Myra Hess organized lunchtime concerts in London's National Gallery. Even during bombing raids, hundreds showed up to hear piano music, while explosions echoed outside. Makes sense, right? When everything around you sounds like destruction, hearing something beautiful becomes an act of rebellion. Then there were the cigarettes. Sounds strange, but tobacco became a universal peace offering. Enemy soldiers sometimes tossed cigarette packs to prisoners during brief moments when officers weren't watching. American GIs shared smokes with German POWs. Russian soldiers offered cigarettes to civilians in occupied towns. Nobody talked during these exchanges, but everyone understood. For 30 seconds they weren't enemies, just tired people craving nicotine. Food sharing created its own kind of hope. Prisoners learned to divide impossibly small portions with mathematical precision. One piece of bread might get split 8 ways, with each person getting exactly the same number of crumbs. Mothers in bombed cities organized stone soup dinners, where everyone contributed whatever they could find. Potato peels, carrot tops, even grass sometimes. The soup tasted awful, but sitting together made it bearable. Letters weren't just about codes either. Sometimes they carried the most ordinary news imaginable. A father wrote to his son about how the neighbor's cat had kittens. A wife told her husband about fixing a broken fence. During a war where everything was extraordinary and terrible, hearing about normal life felt like discovering treasure. These letters got passed around camps and shelters until they fell apart from handling. Well, children found their own ways to create hope. Kids in London turned bomb craters into swimming pools during summer. They organized races through rubble piles and invented games using shrapnel as marbles. Teachers in hiding taught lessons using charcoal on walls, turning basements into classrooms. Learning multiplication tables while bombs fell overhead might sound crazy, but it gave children something normal to focus on. The most powerful hope came from tiny acts of kindness that nobody was supposed to see. A guard who accidentally left a door unlocked. A neighbor who pretended not to notice extra laundry on the line, indicating hidden people. Doctors who listed deaths as natural causes instead of starvation, helping families avoid additional punishment. These people never got medals, but they kept humanity alive when the world seemed to have lost its mind. Religious services happened in the strangest places. Priests held mass in subway tunnels. Jewish families observed Sabbath in hidden rooms with makeshift candles. Muslim prisoners found ways to pray facing east even in cramped camps. Faith became portable, requiring nothing more than whispered words and shared belief. But why did these small acts matter so much? Because they reminded people that the war hadn't erased everything good about being human. When a prisoner shared his last crust of bread, when strangers sang together in a shelter, when children drew pictures on bombed walls, these moments proved that kindness could survive anything. Some hope came from the most unexpected sources. Rats in trenches became unofficial pets. Stray dogs adopted entire refugee families. Wild birds nesting in destroyed buildings showed that life continued despite everything humans were doing to destroy it. Even weeds growing through bomb craters looked beautiful to people who hadn't seen anything green in months. These moments of hope weren't just nice feelings, they became survival tools. People who found reasons to smile, even briefly, lasted longer than those who didn't. Laughter boosted immune systems. Singing together synchronized heartbeats and reduced panic. Hope, it turned out, had actual medical benefits. Of course, hope alone wasn't enough when entire populations faced systematic oppression. Surviving occupation required different strategies entirely, ones that tested every limit of human endurance and creativity. When enemy armies rolled into towns across Europe and Asia, everything changed in a matter of hours. One day you're complaining about your boring math teacher. The next day foreign soldiers are setting up checkpoints on your street corner. The speed of occupation was terrifying. Families would wake up to find tanks parked outside their local bakery, and soldiers speaking unfamiliar languages demanding directions to the town hall. The first thing occupying forces typically did was hunt down every radio in town. These weren't just entertainment devices anymore. They were lifelines to the outside world. Radios meant news from London, updates about Allied movements, and most importantly, hope that this nightmare might actually end someday. So people got creative fast. They buried radios in vegetable gardens, stuffed them inside mattresses, or hid them beneath loose floorboards in barns. The punishment for getting caught with a radio: prison, or worse. But here's the thing about desperate people: they become incredibly resourceful. Mrs. Henderson in occupied Norway kept her radio inside a hollowed-out Bible. Makes sense, right? Who would think to check there? Meanwhile, in occupied France, an entire family took turns listening to BBC broadcasts from a radio hidden inside their grandfather's coffin in the basement. Morbid, but effective. Then there were the impossible demands that came with occupation. Local families were forced to quarter enemy soldiers in their own homes. Picture this: you're 12 years old, and suddenly there's a German officer sleeping in your older brother's bedroom, while your brother is somewhere fighting against Germany. The psychological torture was almost worse than the physical danger. These families had to cook meals for the very people who might arrest them the next day. They had to smile and nod while enemy soldiers sat at their dinner tables, discussing military strategies that could mean life or death for their neighbors. The resistance movements that sprang up were incredibly brave, but they made life dangerous for everyone else too. Secret flyers would appear overnight, warning people about upcoming raids or encouraging sabotage. These weren't professionally printed newspapers. We're talking about handwritten notes passed from person to person, often by children who looked innocent enough to avoid suspicion. Young Marie in occupied Belgium became famous for hiding resistance messages inside her school notebooks. She'd deliver homework assignments that contained coded information about German troop movements. Well, the paranoia reached absurd levels pretty quickly. In some occupied territories, people were arrested for humming the wrong songs. American jazz music became a symbol of rebellion, so getting caught whistling Swing Low Sweet Chariot could land you in serious trouble. The authorities were terrified that music might boost morale or remind people of freedom. Dancing to swing music in occupied Paris wasn't just fun. It was an act of defiance that could get you thrown in jail. Local businesses faced impossible choices daily. Shopkeepers had to decide whether to sell their best goods to occupying forces or hide them for their regular customers who were slowly starving. The baker who saved flour for enemy soldiers might keep his shop open, but his neighbors would never forgive him. The mechanic who refused to fix German vehicles might get shot, but at least he could sleep at night, knowing he hadn't helped the enemy move weapons. Children adapted to this new reality in ways that would break your heart. They learned which streets to avoid, which soldiers might give them candy, and which neighbors couldn't be trusted with secrets. Kids developed an entire vocabulary of hand signals and code words. A simple gesture like scratching your nose might mean Germans coming this way to other children playing nearby. And the weird part is how normal some of this started to feel after months of occupation. Families developed routines around curfews, learned to cook with whatever the occupying forces left behind, and found ways to celebrate birthdays quietly so they wouldn't attract attention. Human beings are remarkably adaptable, even in the worst circumstances. Some occupied towns changed hands multiple times during the war. Imagine living through German occupation, then Soviet liberation, then German recapture, all within 2 years. Each time, the rules changed completely. What got you arrested under German rule might be mandatory under Soviet control. People kept mental notes about which flags to display, which songs to sing, and which neighbors had collaborated with which army. But resistance never completely died, even in the most controlled areas. It just went deeper underground, became more creative, and involved more ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The grandmother, who accidentally gave wrong directions to lost enemy patrols, was fighting back. The postman who delayed delivering certain letters was part of the resistance too. The psychological warfare was relentless, but so was the human spirit. Even under the heaviest occupation, people found ways to maintain dignity and hope. They'd need every ounce of that resilience, especially as the war expanded across the Pacific, where different rules and even harsher conditions awaited millions more. When Germany attacked Poland in 1939, half the world away, another war machine was already grinding into motion. Japan had been fighting in China since 1937, but most people barely noticed. Then December 7th, 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Suddenly the Pacific Ocean became the world's largest battlefield. The Pacific wasn't like Europe. European soldiers fought across familiar farmland and cities. Pacific soldiers faced something completely different. Jungle warfare meant machetes were as important as rifles. Malaria killed more men than bullets in some battles. The heat was so intense that metal equipment became too hot to touch during the day. Rain turned dirt paths into rivers of mud that swallowed jeeps whole. American forces learned jungle fighting the hard way. Training camps back home couldn't prepare anyone for leeches that attached to every exposed piece of skin, or snakes hanging from tree branches, or the way sound traveled strangely through dense jungle, making it impossible to tell where enemy fire was coming from. Soldiers developed a dark sense of humor about it all. They joked that if the Japanese didn't kill them, the bugs would finish the job. But the real nightmare began when soldiers were captured. The Bataan Death March stands as one of the war's most horrific events. In April 1942, After months of fighting with little food or medicine, American and Filipino forces surrendered to the Japanese on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. What happened next defied human decency. Around 75,000 prisoners of war were forced to walk 65 miles in scorching heat with almost no food or water. Japanese guards bayoneted anyone who fell behind. Men with dysentery collapsed and died on the roadside. Guards refused to let prisoners help their sick comrades. Some prisoners tried to catch rainwater in their mouths during brief storms. Others ate grass or leaves when guards weren't watching. The march took different prisoners different amounts of time, but most endured between 5 to 10 days of hell. Those who survived often weighed 30 or 40 pounds less than when they started. Many never fully recovered their health, even after the war ended. Then there were the work camps. Japanese forces used prisoner labor to build railways through impossible terrain. The Burma Railway, connecting Thailand to Burma, became known as the Death Railway. One prisoner died for every railroad tie laid. That's not an exaggeration. It's math based on survivor records. Prisoners worked 12 to 16 hours a day with basic hand tools. They moved tons of earth and rock to carve paths through mountains. Monsoon rains washed away weeks of work in single nights. Cholera and other diseases spread rapidly through the camps. Medical supplies were practically non-existent. Prisoners learned to make splints from bamboo and bandages from torn clothing. Yet somehow, some men found ways to survive and even resist. They sabotaged equipment when guards weren't looking. Small acts but meaningful ones. They shared what little food they had. Veterans later said that sharing often meant the difference between living and dying. A spoonful of rice given to a sick friend might save his life. Local villagers throughout the Pacific Islands risked their own lives to help Allied soldiers. In the Philippines, entire villages hid American prisoners who escaped from Japanese camps. Filipino families shared their food with strangers, even when they barely had enough for themselves. Children served as messengers carrying information between hidden soldiers and resistance groups. Japanese civilians faced their own version of hell as the war progressed. American bombing raids targeted Japanese cities with devastating results. By 1944, Japanese families were digging bomb shelters in their backyards, just like Europeans had done years earlier. They practiced air raid drills and learned to distinguish between different types of aircraft by sound alone. Food rationing in Japan became severe. Rice portions shrank to tiny amounts. People ate sweet potato leaves and bark soup to survive. Children stopped growing properly due to malnutrition. Yet Japanese radio broadcasts continued to claim victory was near. The disconnect between reality and propaganda became impossible to ignore. The Pacific Islands themselves became battlegrounds where nature seemed to pick sides. Coral reefs that provided beautiful scenery in peacetime became death traps during landing operations. Tropical storms could ground aircraft for days, changing battle plans completely. Some islands were so small that artillery fire from one end could reach the other. Others were so vast that soldiers got lost for weeks in unmarked jungle. What made Pacific warfare especially brutal was its island-hopping nature. Each island meant starting over. New terrain, new challenges, new ways to die. Soldiers who survived one island invasion knew they'd likely face another within months. But even in this hell, stories of incredible survival emerged. Men who lived on coconuts and rainwater for weeks. Pilots who crash-landed and walked across entire islands to reach friendly forces. The human capacity to endure seemed limitless when survival was the only option. The Pacific War was reaching its climax by 1944, and resistance fighters across occupied territories were about to make their biggest moves yet. While regular armies fought their big battles, ordinary people were waging their own secret war behind enemy lines. Resistance fighters weren't trained soldiers with fancy uniforms. They were bakers, teachers, farmers, and teenagers who decided they'd had enough of being told what to do by occupying forces. The French resistance became legendary, but it started small, really small. A farmer might leave his barn door unlocked so Allied pilots could hide inside. A school teacher would accidentally give wrong directions to German patrols. These tiny acts of defiance grew into something much bigger and far more dangerous. Then there were the railway saboteurs. Blowing up train tracks became an art form during the war. Resistance fighters learned that removing just a few bolts at the right spot could derail an entire supply train. The trick was doing it without getting caught. German patrols walked the railway lines constantly, so timing was everything. One group in Norway became so good at this that the Germans started calling them railway ghosts. But here's where it gets really interesting. Teenagers often made the best messengers because soldiers didn't suspect them. A 16-year-old girl could walk past a checkpoint carrying resistance codes hidden inside her schoolbooks. Boys would ride bicycles through towns, stopping to tie their shoes while actually leaving messages under loose stones. The Gestapo eventually caught on to these tricks, but by then the kids had invented new ones. French farmers became masters of deception when it came to hiding Allied pilots. A shot-down British airman might spend weeks living in a barn, while the farmer's family brought him food and civilian clothes. The pilots had to learn basic French phrases and local customs quickly. Getting caught meant death for everyone involved, not just the pilot. Yet thousands of farmers took this risk anyway. Let's not forget the Yugoslav partisans, who turned forest living into a military strategy. Led by Josip Broz Tito, these fighters lived in the mountains and forests for years. They built entire underground hospitals in caves. Their doctors performed surgeries by lamplight while German planes flew overhead searching for them. Women fighters were just as common as men in these groups, something that shocked both German and Allied observers. The weird part is how creative resistance fighters became with everyday objects. Sugar poured into gas tanks would ruin vehicle engines. Salt mixed with gunpowder made ammunition useless. Housewives would accidentally put too much starch in German uniforms, making them stiff and uncomfortable. These might sound like pranks, but they added up to serious military damage. Polish resistance fighters pulled off one of the war's most daring information heists. They managed to steal parts of a German V2 rocket and smuggle them to Britain piece by piece. The rocket components were hidden in everything from potato sacks to coffins. British scientists studying these parts learned how to defend against the weapons before Germany could use them effectively. Communication networks became incredibly sophisticated. The Dutch resistance developed a system using laundry hanging on clotheslines. Different arrangements of shirts and sheets sent specific messages about German troop movements. Neighbors could pass military intelligence just by doing their washing. The Germans never figured this one out completely. Underground newspapers kept hope alive in occupied territories. Printing presses were hidden in basements, barns, and abandoned buildings. Distributing these papers was extremely dangerous work, usually done by volunteers who knew they might not come home. Getting caught with resistance newspapers meant immediate arrest and often execution. Radio operators faced constant danger because German detection equipment could locate transmitting radios within hours. Resistance radio operators had to move frequently and broadcast for only short periods. Many operators were caught and killed, but new volunteers always stepped forward to replace them. These radio links provided crucial intelligence about German defenses before D-Day. The Greek resistance showed how effective mountain warfare could be. Greek fighters knew every cave and goat path in their rugged country. They would attack German convoys and then disappear into terrain that vehicles couldn't navigate. German forces had to assign entire divisions just to guard supply routes through Greece. Some resistance activities required incredible patience. Norwegian commandos spent months preparing to sabotage a heavy water plant that Germans were using for nuclear research. They skied across frozen mountains, lived in snow caves, and studied their target for weeks before striking. Their successful mission probably prevented Germany from developing atomic weapons. Every act of resistance created ripple effects throughout entire communities. When partisans blew up a bridge, German forces would often punish nearby villages with curfews, food restrictions, or random arrests. Resistance fighters had to weigh whether their actions would hurt innocent people. Most decided the risk was worth taking because freedom required sacrifice from everyone. What made these resistance movements truly powerful wasn't their weapons or tactics. It was their refusal to accept defeat, even when everything seemed hopeless. But while adults organized these dangerous operations, some of the war's most surprising heroes were still playing in schoolyards and doing homework by candlelight. War doesn't wait for kids to grow up. While adults planned battles and drew maps in secret rooms, children across Europe and Asia were fighting their own war, one that required sneakers instead of boots, creativity instead of weapons, and playground smarts instead of military training. 8-year-old Marie in occupied France discovered that her favorite doll could carry more than just dreams. She carefully hollowed out the head and stuffed tiny rolled papers inside, messages from resistance fighters that needed to reach contacts across town. German soldiers never suspected that a little girl skipping down the street was actually running the most successful courier operation in her district. Her teddy bear's belly held maps. Her jump rope contained coded instructions wrapped around the handles. Child's play became deadly serious business. Then there's the story of Polish kids who figured out that sugar wasn't just for sweetness. When German vehicles parked overnight near their bombed school, these young saboteurs would sneak out after curfew with handfuls of sugar cubes stolen from their meager rations. They'd pour the sugar directly into gas tanks, knowing it would crystallize and destroy engines within hours. Tanks that should have rolled toward the front lines instead broke down before leaving the neighborhood. But why were children so effective at this dangerous game? Simple, nobody suspected them. Japanese children in occupied territories learned to draw detailed maps from memory after watching Allied planes crash. They'd sketch locations of downed aircraft, mark where pilots might be hiding, then pass these drawings to local resistance groups who could organize rescue missions. A child's innocent crayon drawing could mean the difference between a pilot making it home or spending years in a prison camp. Street games evolved into survival training without anyone officially teaching the lessons. Kids developed elaborate systems for warning each other about approaching patrols. A ball bounced 3 times meant German soldiers were coming from the north. A bicycle left leaning against a particular wall signaled that the coast was clear. Hide and seek became practice for the real thing. Sometimes the difference between staying hidden and getting caught determined whether entire families lived or died. Well, curfews certainly changed the rules of childhood. Instead of playing until parents called them in for dinner, kids had to master the art of cramming entire adventures into shortened daylight hours. Games that once lasted all day were compressed into frantic bursts of activity. Tag became a sprint. Soccer matches turned into lightning-fast competitions where everyone had to scatter and disappear the moment shadows grew long. Some of the most daring child operatives worked in concentration camps where their small size became a crucial advantage. They could crawl through spaces too narrow for adults, slip between fence posts and move around camps without attracting as much attention as grown-ups. Kids smuggled medicine, carried messages between barracks, and even helped dig escape tunnels by moving soil in toy buckets and lunchboxes. The weird part is how normal this all felt to them at the time. Children adapt faster than adults to new circumstances. What seemed impossibly dangerous to their parents became just another part of daily routine for these young survivors. They learned to read the sky for bomber formations, like other kids learned to read clocks. They could identify different types of aircraft by engine sound alone, knowledge that could save lives when every second counted. Let's not forget the incredible memory skills these children developed. In Warsaw, kids memorized entire neighborhood layouts, including which buildings had basements that connected to sewer systems. They became living maps, able to guide adults through escape routes in complete darkness. Some could recite the schedules of enemy patrols down to the minute, information gathered through weeks of careful observation disguised as innocent play. American children in occupied Pacific territories learned similar skills. They cached supplies in jungle hiding spots, developed silent hand signals for communication, and mastered the art of moving through dense vegetation without leaving tracks. Their knowledge of local terrain often surpassed that of trained soldiers who'd been stationed there for months. And the courage required. These weren't superhuman kids, they were ordinary children who found extraordinary strength when circumstances demanded it. A 12-year-old in occupied Norway once led a group of downed British airmen through mountain passes for 3 days, navigating by stars and avoiding German search parties. She'd learned the route by following her grandfather on hunting trips before the war started. The most remarkable aspect of these young heroes wasn't their individual acts of bravery, though those were certainly impressive. It was how quickly they learned to think like adults while still maintaining the innocence that made their cover stories believable. But even the smartest, bravest children couldn't always outsmart war. Some got caught, others made mistakes that cost lives. The lucky ones survived to tell their stories decades later, though many never spoke about their wartime activities until they were grandparents themselves. Their playground revolution had prepared them for survival, but nothing could have prepared them for what came next when the most daring escape attempts in history began unfolding around them. When you're trapped behind enemy lines with nothing but your wits, desperation breeds creativity. World War II produced some of the most audacious escape attempts in human history. These weren't Hollywood stunts, these were real people facing death who decided they'd rather die trying to get home than waste away in captivity. Take the story of Canadian pilot George Swenner, shot down over Germany in 1943. His plane crashed in a snowy forest, and he found himself alone with a broken leg and temperatures dropping to -20 degrees. Most people would have surrendered immediately. Swenner decided to walk home instead, to Canada, through occupied Europe. With a broken leg, he fashioned a crude splint from airplane wreckage and began hobbling westward through the woods. For 6 days he survived on pine needles and melted snow. When German search parties got too close, he buried himself in snowdrifts and waited. The weird part is he actually made it 30 miles before friendly partisans found him and smuggled him to safety. 30 miles on a broken leg through enemy territory in winter. But individual escapes were just the beginning. The real masterpiece was happening in a prisoner of war camp called Stalag Luft III. Allied airmen had been planning something so ambitious it sounds like fiction. They were going to dig 3 tunnels simultaneously, each over 300 feet long, complete with electric lighting, air pumps and underground railways made from bedboards. The prisoners gave these tunnels nicknames: Tom, Dick, and Harry. They distributed 600 tons of sandy soil by hiding it in their pockets and scattering it around the compound during exercise periods. Guards never noticed because the prisoners had sewn special pouches into their pants. They'd pull strings to release the sand as they walked, leaving trails that looked completely natural. Then there was the engineering problem. These tunnels had to go 30 feet underground to avoid detection equipment. The prisoners built air pumps from tin cans and bellows made from sleeping bags. They strung electrical wire stolen bit by bit from around the camp. One prisoner, a former mining engineer, designed wooden supports that could hold tons of earth without collapsing. The forged documents were another level of genius entirely. Prisoners created fake identification papers, travel permits, and work authorizations that looked completely authentic. They made ink from crushed pencil leads and boot polish. Photography was done with a camera built from tin cans and stolen lenses. Maps were traced from memory and hidden inside book covers. What's remarkable is how many people were involved. Over 600 prisoners contributed to the effort in some way. Lookouts, diggers, forgers, tailors who modified civilian clothes, and even guys whose only job was to memorize train schedules overheard from guards' conversations. Everyone had a role. The breakout happened on March 24, 1944. 76 men crawled through Tunnel Harry and emerged in the woods beyond the prison fence. They scattered across Europe, traveling by train, bicycle, and on foot. Some posed as foreign workers. Others pretended to be businessmen or refugees. Only 3 made it all the way home. The rest were recaptured within days or weeks. 50 were executed on direct orders from Hitler, who was furious about the escape. The tragedy overshadowed the incredible achievement. But think about what they accomplished. 76 men simultaneously disappeared from a maximum security facility that the Germans had claimed was escape-proof. Not all escapes required months of planning. Sometimes quick thinking was enough. American airman Charles Plum jumped from a moving train carrying prisoners to a concentration camp. He landed hard, dislocated his shoulder, and spent 2 weeks hiding in barns and eating raw potatoes. Local farmers eventually helped him reach Allied lines, but only after he proved he was American by singing baseball songs and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Civilians created escape networks too. The Dutch Paris Line helped downed airmen and Jewish refugees cross from Holland to Spain. Guides memorized safe routes through forests and mountains, complete with backup plans if patrol schedules changed. Children served as messengers carrying coded information about German troop movements hidden in school notebooks. The courage required for these escapes is hard to comprehend. Every step outside the prison walls or hiding place meant risking immediate execution. Helpers faced the same fate if caught. Entire families were shot for hiding one Allied soldier, yet thousands of people participated in these networks, creating invisible highways to freedom across occupied Europe. What made ordinary people take such extraordinary risks? Many survivors say it came down to simple math. Staying put meant slow death from starvation or disease. Running meant quick death if caught, but also a chance at life. When those are your options, the choice becomes surprisingly clear. These escape stories reveal something fundamental about human nature under extreme pressure. When everything seems impossible, creativity flourishes. When survival is at stake, strangers become family. But escaping was only the beginning of survival. Once free, these people still had to find ways to live through the war's final chaotic months. Against all odds, some of the most unlikely people survived World War II. Babies who entered the world during bombing raids grew up to live full lives. Children born in London's underground stations while sirens wailed overhead became teachers, doctors, and engineers. Their first breath came mixed with dust and fear, but they thrived anyway. One particular story stands out. A pregnant woman in Warsaw went into labor during a German attack. The building shook, windows shattered around her, but her baby arrived healthy, crying louder than the bombs falling outside. That child survived the entire war and lived to be 93 years old. Her secret: She claimed the explosions taught her never to fear loud noises. Then there are the wounded soldiers who refused to give up. A British pilot lost both legs when his plane crashed in France. Instead of accepting defeat, he designed new ways to walk. After the war, he started a sports club for other amputees. They played basketball, swam competitively, and even learned to ski. His artificial legs didn't slow him down one bit. Veterans with missing arms became artists, holding paintbrushes between their teeth. Some learned to write beautiful letters with their feet. One American soldier who lost his right hand became a famous pianist, playing complex pieces with just his left hand and a few prosthetic fingers. The music he created moved audiences to tears. But perhaps the most remarkable survivors were the concentration camp prisoners who lived through the unthinkable. A Polish woman weighed only 60 pounds when Allied soldiers found her. Doctors said she had weeks to live. Instead, she spent the next 50 years traveling the world, telling her story to school children. She outlived most of her liberators. Her survival trick: she collected small pebbles in the camp and arranged them into patterns during the worst moments. The tiny stones gave her something to focus on besides hunger and fear. After the war, she kept a jar of pebbles on her kitchen table, as a reminder that even the smallest things can provide hope. Let's not forget the incredible stories of pets finding their way home across battlefields. A German shepherd named Rex walked over 800 miles to return to his family in Belgium. He crossed 3 countries, avoided minefields, and somehow knew exactly which direction to travel. When he finally scratched at his family's door, he was thin but wagging his tail. A British cat named Smokey became legendary for surviving the London Blitz. She lived in the same bombed-out building for 3 years, catching mice and drinking rainwater. Local firefighters tried to rescue her dozens of times, but she always returned to her ruins. After the war, the neighborhood rebuilt around her chosen spot. Smokey lived there until she was 22 years old. Some of the most amazing survivors were people who had every reason to give up but didn't. An elderly French baker lost his shop, his home, and most of his family during the occupation. At 70 years old, he started over from nothing. He mixed flour and water in bomb craters, baking bread over fires made from rubble. His neighbors said his loaves tasted better than before the war. The weird part is how many survivors credited their rescue to pure luck. A Jewish family in Holland avoided capture because their baby cried at exactly the right moment. German soldiers were searching their building, getting closer to the hidden room behind a bookshelf. Just as the soldiers reached their floor, the baby's cry echoed from a completely different apartment. The soldiers rushed toward the sound, missing the hidden family by seconds. Another family survived because their father was colorblind. He couldn't tell the difference between red and green signal flares. One night, he led his family toward what he thought was a friendly signal. It turned out to be enemy territory, but the soldiers there were deserters who helped them escape instead of turning them in. His disability accidentally saved their lives. Then there's the story of identical twins separated during evacuation. They spent 4 years in different countries, not knowing if the other was alive. Both boys kept identical diaries without knowing it. After the war, they discovered they had written almost the same words on the same dates, thousands of miles apart. They even drew similar pictures of their lost home. Grandparents who survived often share the strangest details about what kept them going. One man said he survived because he promised his pet goldfish he would come home to feed it. A woman claimed she stayed alive by mentally redecorating her bombed house room by room. Another survivor said he made it through prison camp by inventing elaborate recipes in his head, planning the perfect meal for after the war. These unlikely survivors prove something important about human strength. The people who made it through weren't always the strongest or smartest. They were often just the most stubborn. But as the war entered its final phase, even the most determined survivors wondered if they could hold on much longer. By early 1945, the war machine that once seemed unstoppable was grinding to a halt. Hitler's thousand-year Reich was crumbling faster than a stale cookie. The Allies weren't just knocking on Germany's door anymore. They'd kicked it down and invited themselves in for dinner. The Rhine River had been Germany's last natural defense. For centuries, armies had stared across those dark waters, knowing that crossing meant everything. Well, the Americans crossed it like they were going to a weekend barbecue. General Patton didn't just build bridges, he practically threw them across the river overnight. His engineers worked so fast that German defenders woke up to find tanks already rumbling through their backyards. Then there's Eisenhower's plan, The Supreme Allied commander had been moving chess pieces across Europe for months, and now every piece was exactly where it needed to be. British forces pushed from the north. Americans hammered from the west. The coordination was so precise it would make a Swiss watchmaker jealous. But the real nightmare for Germany was coming from the east. Soviet forces weren't just advancing, they were steamrolling everything in their path. Stalin had been waiting years for payback, and his Red Army was delivering it with interest. Tank after tank rolled across the Polish plains, each one carrying the fury of millions of dead Russians. German civilians caught in the middle faced an impossible choice: stay and risk the advancing armies, or flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Families who had lived in the same towns for generations suddenly became refugees in their own country. The roads filled with horse-drawn carts, baby carriages loaded with possessions, and people walking with suitcases that got heavier with every mile. Basements became entire worlds. Families descended into their cellars, expecting to wait out a few days of fighting. Instead, they found themselves living underground for weeks. Children who had never seen a bomb shelter suddenly became experts at identifying aircraft by sound. That low rumble, friendly, that high-pitched whine, time to pray. Food became more precious than gold. A can of beans could buy you a ride out of town. A loaf of bread was worth a family heirloom. People ate things their grandparents would have fed to pigs. Dandelion soup became a delicacy when you hadn't eaten meat in 3 weeks. The weird part is how normal abnormal became. Mothers changed diapers while artillery shells exploded overhead. Kids played hopscotch between crater holes. Families celebrated birthdays with candles they couldn't afford to burn, singing happy birthday in whispers so enemy patrols wouldn't hear them. Water became another enemy. Pipes burst from bomb damage, leaving entire neighborhoods dry. People melted snow in cooking pots, boiled rainwater collected in tin cans, and treated every drop like liquid gold. Taking a bath became a luxury reserved for special occasions, and there weren't many special occasions when your city was being bombed daily. Communication died first. Phone lines cut. Radio stations went silent. Mail stopped arriving. Families had no idea if their relatives 3 streets away were alive or dead. Some people wrote letters they never planned to send, just to feel connected to someone somewhere. Others carved messages into basement walls, hoping future generations would understand what they'd endured. Let's not forget the children in all this chaos. Kids who should have been learning multiplication tables were instead learning how to distinguish between incoming and outgoing artillery. They invented games that would horrify peacetime parents. Dodge the shrapnel wasn't supposed to be a real activity, but when you're 8 years old, you adapt faster than adults ever could. Medical care became medieval. Doctors operated by candlelight using kitchen knives sterilized over open flames. Bandages were torn from bedsheets. Aspirin was rationed like diamonds. Broken bones were set with wooden splints carved from furniture legs. Pain medication. A shot of whatever alcohol someone had hidden in their basement. The city of Berlin became the ultimate prize in this deadly game. Everyone knew that whoever controlled Hitler's capital would write the history books. Soviet artillery could be heard in the suburbs. American bombers flew overhead so regularly that people set their watches by them. The city that had once hosted Olympics and grand parades was now a maze of rubble and desperation. Newspapers, when you could find them, carried headlines that changed daily. Miracle weapons coming soon, became strategic withdrawal successful, which became final victory within reach. The propaganda machine kept spinning even as the wheels came off the wagon, and through it all, ordinary people did extraordinary things. They shared their last crust of bread with strangers. They helped wounded soldiers regardless of which uniform they wore. They kept their humanity when the world had gone completely insane. But the most important headlines were being written in conference rooms far from the fighting, where men in suits were already planning what would happen when the shooting finally stopped. The tanks rolled in like thunder, but this time nobody ran for cover. After years of diving into basements and scrambling for shelters, people actually rushed toward the rumbling sounds. Allied soldiers couldn't believe what they were seeing as they approached the first prison camps and occupied towns. Skeletal figures pressed against barbed wire fences, some too weak to stand but still trying to wave. Liberation wasn't the Hollywood moment most soldiers expected. The smell hit them first, then came the sight of prisoners who looked more like walking ghosts than human beings. Many had survived on watery soup and scraps of bread for months or even years. When American GIs handed out chocolate bars, some prisoners were too sick to eat them. Their bodies had forgotten how to handle real food. But here's the strange part: many prisoners didn't trust their rescuers at first. Some had been tricked before by guards pretending to offer freedom. Others had witnessed fake liberations used as cruel psychological games. A few actually hid when they heard the tanks approaching, thinking it might be another transport to a worse place. The celebrations in town squares told a different story entirely. When word spread that the war was really ending, crowds gathered despite the danger. Women kissed soldiers from countries they'd never heard of. Children who had spent years whispering suddenly shouted with joy. Church bells rang for the first time in years, creating a sound many had forgotten existed. Then there were the practical problems. Nobody talks about much. What do you do with thousands of freed prisoners who are too weak to walk home? Where do you house people whose countries no longer exist on any map? How do you feed crowds of starving people without making them sicker? Military doctors quickly learned that giving rich food to severely malnourished prisoners could actually kill them. Some of the most touching moments happened quietly. A French resistance fighter recognized his brother among a group of freed prisoners. Two sisters who had been separated for 3 years spotted each other across a crowded displaced persons camp. But for every happy reunion, there were dozens of people scanning faces, hopefully, only to realize their loved ones weren't coming back. The liberating soldiers faced their own shock. Many had been fighting for years but had never seen the full extent of what they were fighting against. Tough sergeants who had survived beach landings and street fighting broke down crying when they opened certain camp buildings. Some wrote letters home that their families couldn't read without weeping. Communication became a massive puzzle. Freed prisoners spoke dozens of different languages and dialects. Some had been silent for so long they struggled to form words. Others talked non-stop, desperate to tell someone their story after years of forced silence. Military translators worked around the clock, but often simple gestures worked better than words. Medical care presented unique challenges too. Doctors encountered diseases they'd only read about in textbooks. Prisoners suffered from malnutrition, typhus, tuberculosis, and infections that had gone untreated for years. Field hospitals quickly ran out of supplies trying to help everyone at once. Recovery meant starting with tiny portions of bland food and gradually building up strength over weeks or months. The psychological impact was just as complex. Many freed prisoners experienced what we'd now call survivor's guilt. They wondered why they had lived when so many others hadn't. Some felt guilty about the small compromises they'd made to stay alive. Others worried about family members they'd left behind or lost track of during the chaos. News of liberation spread through underground networks faster than official military communications. Resistance fighters used hidden radios to pass along information about which areas had been freed. Families in hiding listened desperately for news about their specific towns or regions. The wait for accurate information felt endless when freedom was supposedly just around the corner. Local populations reacted in dramatically different ways. Some towns welcomed liberators with parades and flowers. Others remained sullen and suspicious, especially if they'd been forced to collaborate with occupying forces. A few communities discovered that their neighbors had been hiding Jewish families for years without anyone knowing. Perhaps the most remarkable thing was how quickly some survivors began helping others. Prisoners who could barely walk shared their meager rations with weaker inmates. Former resistance fighters immediately volunteered to help military units locate other hidden camps and safe houses. People who had every reason to think only of themselves often became the most generous helpers. The physical act of opening camp gates became symbolic, but the real liberation took much longer. Freedom meant different things to different people. For some it was the first full meal in years. For others it was sleeping without fear of sirens or guards. Many prisoners had to learn how to make choices again after years of having every decision made for them. But even as liberation swept across Europe and the Pacific, millions of people still faced an uncertain future. The war might be ending, but peace would bring its own challenges. The guns fell silent, but the real nightmare was just beginning. When soldiers finally lowered their weapons and families emerged from their hiding places, they found a world that looked like it had been chewed up and spit out by some giant monster. Cities that once bustled with life now resembled moonscapes of broken concrete and twisted metal. Dresden had been flattened so completely that survivors couldn't find their own streets. Warsaw looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer to every building for miles. In Tokyo, entire neighborhoods had simply vanished, leaving behind only charred foundations and memories. The war was over, sure, but home. Home was often just a pile of rubble with maybe a chimney sticking up like a lonely gravestone. Families who had dreamed of returning to their cozy kitchens and familiar bedrooms instead stood staring at empty lots where their houses used to be. One woman in Berlin spent 3 hours looking for her apartment building before realizing she was standing on top of what used to be her basement. The building had been bombed so thoroughly that the debris barely rose above street level. Then there were the people wandering around like ghosts. Millions of them, carrying everything they owned in a single suitcase or paper bag. These weren't tourists on vacation. They were displaced persons, or DPs as everyone called them. Former prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, forced laborers, and regular families who had been pushed around Europe like chess pieces for 6 years. The lucky ones found shelter in abandoned train stations. Families made little camps between the railway tracks, hanging blankets for privacy and cooking whatever scraps they could find over small fires. Children played hopscotch on platforms where elegant passengers once waited for the Orient Express. Railway stations in major cities became temporary cities themselves, housing thousands of people who had nowhere else to go. But here's where things get really heartbreaking. Kids who had been separated from their families years earlier were now desperately searching for parents they might not even recognize. The Red Cross set up massive bulletin boards covered with thousands of handwritten notes. Looking for Maria Kowalski, last seen in Krakow 1942. Heinrich Müller seeks his wife Anna and daughter Sophie. Anyone who knew the Rosenberg family from Vienna, please contact. Some children had been so young when separated that they couldn't even remember their real names. They'd been given new identities, new families, new languages. Imagine trying to find your mother when you can't remember what she looks like, and you're not even sure what your actual name is. The Red Cross workers became part detective, part social worker, part miracle worker. Meanwhile, help was trickling in from countries that hadn't been bombed to bits. American and Canadian ships arrived loaded with food, blankets and medical supplies. But distributing aid to millions of people across a continent of destroyed roads and blown-up bridges, that was like trying to deliver pizza during an earthquake. Local communities that had survived started sharing whatever they had. A baker in a small French town might feed 50 strangers a day, even though his own family was living on thin soup. People who had lost everything still somehow found ways to help others who had lost even more. Human kindness, it turns out, is harder to destroy than buildings. The weird part is how quickly people adapted to living in ruins. Kids turned bombed-out buildings into playgrounds. Adults set up shops in the shells of destroyed stores. Life had to go on, even if normal was now sleeping in a basement that used to be someone's wine cellar and washing clothes in a fountain that once decorated a fancy park. Recovery wasn't just about rebuilding houses and streets. Entire industries had to be recreated from scratch. Hospitals operated out of tents. Schools met in abandoned churches. Businesses ran from the backs of trucks. Everyone became incredibly resourceful, because they had to be. You learn to fix almost anything when replacement parts don't exist, and won't exist for years. Some survivors showed up to their hometowns only to find that other families had moved into the ruins of their houses. Awkward doesn't begin to describe those conversations. "Excuse me, but I think you're living in what's left of my kitchen." Property disputes took years to sort out, especially when all the paperwork had been burned in the bombing. The physical destruction was obvious. You could see it, measure it, photograph it. But the deeper damage, the kind that lived in people's minds and hearts, would take much longer to understand. While crews worked to clear the rubble and rebuild the roads, survivors were dealing with invisible wounds that would shape their lives for decades to come. The bombing had stopped. The shooting had ended. Victory parades filled the streets with music and celebration, but something unexpected happened to millions of people who survived World War II. The war kept going inside their heads. Sarah Chen was 8 when the Blitz began in London. She spent 57 nights sleeping on subway platforms, listening to bombs fall above her head. When the war ended in 1945, her family moved back to their rebuilt home. Everything seemed normal again. Well, almost everything. Sarah couldn't sleep through thunderstorms for the next 40 years. The rumbling sound brought her right back to those underground nights, heart pounding like she was 8 years old again. The weird part is how many survivors never talked about this. They thought something was wrong with them. Back then people didn't understand trauma the way we do now. Soldiers who jumped at loud noises were told to toughen up. Women who cried during fireworks were labeled hysterical. Children who wet their beds years after the war were simply punished. Nobody connected these reactions to what they'd lived through. Dr. Jacob Mendelsohn spent 3 years hiding in a Polish barn. After liberation, he became a successful physician in New York. His patients never knew that he kept a small suitcase packed under his bed until 1963. Every night for 18 years he went to sleep, ready to run. His wife found the suitcase by accident and asked about it. Jacob broke down crying. It was the first time he'd talked about those barn years with anyone. Then there were the nightmares. Frank Morrison was a British pilot shot down over Germany. He spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp, surviving on watery soup and stale bread. After the war, he returned home, got married, and started a construction business. But every few weeks, Frank would wake up screaming. In his dreams, he was still in that camp, still hungry, still waiting for guards to burst through the door. His wife learned to keep a glass of water by the bed and speak softly until he remembered where he was. Let's not forget the children who forgot how to be children. Marie Dubois was 12 when her family went into hiding in occupied France. For 3 years she couldn't laugh loudly, couldn't run, couldn't even cry without someone shushing her. Silence meant survival. After liberation, Marie's parents expected her to bounce back to normal childhood, but she'd forgotten how to play. Loud games frightened her. Birthday parties felt dangerous. She spoke in whispers until she was 16. The really heartbreaking part was how some survivors felt guilty for being alive. Anna Kowalski lost her parents and 3 brothers in a concentration camp. She survived because she was young and strong enough for factory work. After the war, well-meaning people called her lucky. Lucky, Anna carried crushing guilt for decades. Why did she live when her family died? She avoided mirrors because she saw her dead brother's eyes in her own face. For years she barely ate, feeling guilty for every meal her family couldn't share. Food became a complicated trigger for many survivors. People who'd lived through starvation couldn't throw away leftovers. Even wealthy survivors hoarded bread crusts and saved every scrap. Martha Goldstein kept crackers hidden in her bedroom until she died in 1987. Her granddaughter found dozens of packages tucked in dresser drawers, some dating back 20 years. Martha had survived the Warsaw Ghetto, where she'd watched people die from hunger. Her mind never forgot that lesson, even when her kitchen was full. Sudden movements and unexpected sounds sent survivors diving for cover years later. Car backfires became bomb explosions. Sirens triggered panic attacks. Even happy sounds could cause problems. Wedding bells reminded some people of air raid alarms. Children's laughter sometimes sounded like screaming to damaged ears. But trauma wasn't just individual. Entire communities struggled with invisible wounds. German civilians who'd lived through bombing campaigns flinched at airplane sounds for decades. Japanese survivors of atomic bombs passed down anxiety to children who weren't even born during the war. Somehow, fear traveled through families like a hidden inheritance. The silence made everything worse. Veterans groups didn't talk about emotional problems. Families avoided unpleasant topics at dinner tables. Survivors felt isolated, thinking they were the only ones struggling. In reality, millions of people were having the same nightmares, the same flashbacks, the same crushing anxiety. Many survivors developed elaborate rituals to feel safe. Some checked locks 15 times before bed. Others slept with lights on for the rest of their lives. Former prisoners kept emergency supplies hidden in their homes. These behaviors seemed strange to people who hadn't lived through war, but they made perfect sense to minds that remembered when safety was never guaranteed. Recovery took different forms for different people. Some found healing through talking with other survivors. Others buried themselves in work or family. Many never fully recovered, but learned to live with their invisible scars. The trauma became part of who they were, like a limp from an old injury that never quite healed right. What's remarkable is how many of these wounded people went on to build extraordinary lives, carrying both their scars and their strength into peacetime. When the war finally ended, everyone expected heroes to come marching home to parades and medals. The reality, most of the people who saved lives, risked everything, and made the biggest difference never got so much as a handshake. They just went back to their regular jobs like nothing happened. Take the railway workers across occupied Europe. These guys spent years sabotaging Nazi supply trains, hiding escaped prisoners, and passing secret messages through underground networks. Did they get recognition? Nope. After the war, some actually got fired for causing delays during wartime. Their bosses conveniently forgot that those delays probably saved thousands of Allied lives. Then there were the women codebreakers at Bletchley Park. These brilliant minds cracked Nazi communication codes that shortened the war by years. Churchill himself said their work was worth more than entire armies. But when peace came, they were told to go home, keep quiet about what they did, and never speak of it again. Most people didn't even know these women existed until decades later. The resistance fighters had it even worse. In some countries, the very people who fought against Nazi occupation found themselves arrested by their own governments after liberation. Why? Politics got messy fast. Some resistance groups were communist, others weren't. The new governments didn't want any competition, so they labeled yesterday's heroes as today's troublemakers. French villagers who hid Jewish families for years often faced suspicion from neighbors who wondered how they survived so well during occupation. Instead of praise for their courage, they got whispered accusations about collaborating with the enemy. Makes sense, right? Save lives, get blamed for it, but the real tragedy was what happened to the helpers who got caught. To Maria, a Polish woman, hid 17 Jewish children in her cellar for 2 years. When the Nazis discovered them in 1944, they shot her entire family. After the war, nobody knew her name. No monument, no medal, no mention in history books. Just silence. Local doctors who treated wounded resistance fighters without asking questions faced similar fates. They couldn't exactly put treated illegal patients while dodging Gestapo on their post-war resumes. Many lost their medical licenses for unauthorized procedures during wartime. The weird part, some actual war criminals got better treatment than the people who helped victims. While genuine heroes struggled to find work, former Nazi scientists were quietly recruited by both American and Soviet governments. Operation Paperclip brought over 1,600 German scientists to America. Meanwhile, the baker who fed escaped prisoners in his village couldn't get anyone to vouch for his character. Underground railway conductors who guided people across borders faced particular challenges. These networks saved thousands, but proving their activities meant admitting to illegal border crossings. Many countries weren't interested in honoring people who had technically broken immigration laws, even for humanitarian reasons. Jewish survivors often couldn't properly thank their rescuers because they themselves were dealing with trauma and displacement. Some families never reconnected after the chaos of liberation. The woman who hid you might live 3 villages away, but with destroyed records and displaced populations, finding each other became nearly impossible. Military heroes had their own problems with recognition. The highest decorated American soldier of the war was Audie Murphy, who earned every medal possible, but when he came home he couldn't sleep, jumped at loud noises, and struggled with what we now call PTSD. The army that celebrated his battlefield courage offered little help for his invisible wounds. Let's not forget the translators and local guides who helped Allied forces in occupied territories. These people knew the terrain, spoke the languages, and often made the difference between successful missions and disasters. After victory, they were frequently left behind as local assets, forgotten by the very armies they served. Even prisoners of war, who showed extraordinary leadership in camps, rarely received recognition. Men who organized food sharing, maintained morale, and planned escapes found themselves competing with millions of other veterans for jobs in peacetime. Being good at surviving captivity wasn't exactly a transferable skill on civilian applications. The children who served as messengers and lookouts grew up to find that nobody took their contributions seriously. Adults dismissed their wartime activities as games, rather than recognizing the genuine courage it took for a 12-year-old to carry coded messages through enemy checkpoints. Well, recognition did come eventually for some, but by then many had already died. The first major ceremonies honoring civilian rescuers didn't happen until the 1960s and 70s. By that time, countless heroes had passed away without ever hearing thank you. The absence of immediate recognition created an interesting problem. Without official validation, many survivors questioned whether their own memories were accurate. Did they really help save lives, or were they just ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances? This self-doubt haunted many for decades. What happened next would slowly change how the world remembered its forgotten heroes, but the damage was already done. The bombs had stopped falling, but the real work was just beginning. Cities across Europe looked like giant puzzles with most pieces missing. Berlin had 75 million cubic meters of rubble scattered through its streets. London's East End resembled a moonscape. Warsaw, well, 85% of it simply didn't exist anymore. But here's what's amazing about people. They don't stay down long. In bombed-out London, kids turned massive craters into swimming pools during summer rains. They'd dive into these accidental lakes while their parents hauled bricks and timber nearby. The children called it crater swimming, which sounds way more fun than it probably was. Meanwhile, adults organized themselves into work crews, passing chunks of concrete hand to hand like the world's most depressing bucket brigade. Schools became construction sites by day and classrooms by evening. Teachers held lessons wherever they found four walls still standing. Sometimes that meant borrowing space in a butcher shop or setting up desks in a church basement. One teacher in Hamburg taught multiplication tables while hammering nails into new window frames. Her students learned carpentry and math simultaneously, which actually makes perfect sense when you think about it. The food situation slowly improved from absolutely terrible to merely pretty bad. Victory Gardens, which had sustained families during the worst years, now expanded into neighborhood farms. Empty lots where houses once stood became potato patches and cabbage fields. Former bomb shelters got converted into root cellars for storing winter vegetables. People discovered they could grow quite a lot in the spaces where their living rooms used to be. Women who'd spent years managing everything while men fought overseas weren't about to stop being resourceful. They organized tool-sharing networks, seed exchanges, and collective childcare arrangements. Mrs. Henderson in Manchester started a skills swap where people taught each other practical abilities. She'd trade sewing lessons for plumbing repairs, cooking classes for electrical work. These informal schools produced surprisingly skilled graduates. Returning soldiers faced their own rebuilding challenges. Many came home to discover their old jobs no longer existed, or that someone else was doing them quite well. Thank you very much. But necessity breeds innovation. Former tank mechanics became auto repair specialists. Pilots started small shipping businesses. Combat medics opened neighborhood clinics. The skills they'd learned in extreme circumstances translated surprisingly well to civilian problems. Then there were the unexpected business opportunities. Salvage companies employed hundreds of people sorting through debris for anything useful. Metal dealers made fortunes collecting scrap iron from destroyed buildings and vehicles. One enterprising fellow in France started a company that specialized in removing unexploded bombs from construction sites. Talk about job security, there were thousands of those things buried everywhere. Housing presented the biggest puzzle. Millions of people needed homes, but materials were scarce and money scarcer. Communities got creative. They organized barn-raising style events where entire neighborhoods would gather to rebuild one family's house, then move on to the next. The Quonset hut, originally designed for military use, became temporary housing for countless families. These metal half-cylinders weren't pretty, but they went up fast and kept the rain out. Children adapted fastest, as children do. They made toys from artillery shell casings, used bomb craters as fort foundations, and invented games involving the reconstruction work happening around them. Kids in Berlin played Builder and Wrecker, which was basically their version of Cops and Robbers but with construction equipment. Their resilience amazed adults who were still processing what they'd survived. Community kitchens evolved into neighborhood restaurants. What started as necessity, sharing cooking duties when individual families lacked proper stoves, became social gathering places. Mrs. Kowalski's kitchen in Detroit fed 30 people every evening. Former strangers became extended family around those crowded tables. Black markets gradually transformed into legitimate businesses. The fellow who'd been sneaking cigarettes across checkpoints opened a tobacco shop. The woman who'd traded rationed butter for medicine started a small pharmacy. These underground networks had created entrepreneurial skills that served people well in peacetime. Letters started moving normally again, reconnecting families scattered across continents. The postal services, operating out of makeshift offices and borrowed trucks, handled unprecedented volumes of mail. People were frantically searching for relatives, confirming addresses, sharing news of survival and loss. Some letters took months to reach their destinations, but they eventually found their way home. Marriages boomed as couples delayed by war finally had their ceremonies. Babies arrived in record numbers. The baby boom wasn't just an American phenomenon. Young families needed cribs, high chairs, and larger apartments. This domestic demand actually helped fuel economic recovery, as factories converted from military to consumer production. The rebuilding wasn't just physical. People were reconstructing their sense of normal, their daily routines, their relationships. But some experiences from those terrible years couldn't simply be forgotten or pushed aside. The memories lingered, shaping how survivors viewed the world and their place in it. These internal scars would prove just as lasting as the physical reconstruction happening all around them. War officially ends, But something unexpected happens in families around the world. People who lived through the worst moments in human history suddenly start talking, not immediately, mind you. First comes the awkward silence at dinner tables, where nobody knows how to bring up the elephant in the room. Then gradually, almost by accident, the stories begin trickling out. A grandfather mentions how he used to catch rats in the trenches for extra protein. His grandson nearly chokes on his cereal. A grandmother casually talks about the time she hid 12 people in her basement for 3 months. Her granddaughter stops texting and actually looks up from her phone. These aren't the sanitized versions from history books. These are raw, unfiltered memories that have been locked away for decades. The weird part is how ordinary these extraordinary people make their survival sound. "Oh, we just made do," they say about living on turnip soup for 6 months. Everyone helped each other out. They mention about risking execution to hide Jewish families. Makes sense, right? Except it doesn't, because what they did was incredible. But here's what happens next that nobody expects. The physical evidence starts surfacing too. Boxes emerge from attics and basements, filled with things that tell stories words cannot capture. A faded letter written on toilet paper by a prisoner of war becomes more precious than gold to his daughter. She finds it tucked inside her father's old work boots. 40 years after the war ended, the letter describes Christmas dinner in the camp, watery potato soup, and a single shared cigarette split among 8 men. Her father had never mentioned being a prisoner, ever. Then there are the medals nobody knew existed. Bronze stars hidden in sock drawers, purple hearts wrapped in old newspapers, campaign ribbons stuffed inside coffee cans. The families find them and wonder why their heroes never wore them, never bragged, never even mentioned them. Well, turns out many survivors felt guilty about being called heroes when their friends didn't make it home. Museum curators start noticing something fascinating. Families begin donating the most random objects you can imagine. A bent spoon used to dig escape tunnels, a child's wooden shoe from occupied Holland, a piece of bread, rock hard and preserved, from the siege of Leningrad. Each item carries a story that textbooks miss completely. The suitcases are particularly haunting. Small leather cases packed by children who thought they were going on short trips. Inside, museums find tiny treasures, a stuffed rabbit, a marble collection, a diary with entries that stop mid-sentence. These objects speak louder than any monument ever could. Let's not forget the unexpected reunions happening decades later. A French resistance fighter tracks down the American pilot she helped escape in 1943. A Holocaust survivor finds the family that hid her for 2 years. Technology makes these connections possible in ways that seemed impossible right after the war. Some meetings happen entirely by accident. 2 elderly men sit next to each other on a park bench in Chicago. They start chatting about the weather, then their backgrounds come up. Turns out one was a German prisoner, the other his American guard from the same camp. They become best friends. And the weird part is how these survivors handle their fame once their stories spread. Most resist it completely. They insist they weren't heroes, just people doing what needed to be done. They deflect praise and redirect conversations to friends who didn't survive, but their families push back. You need to tell these stories, grown children insist. Future generations need to know what really happened. Photography plays an unexpected role in preserving these memories. Professional photographers start documenting survivors, racing against time as the generation ages. Every wrinkle tells a story, every scar holds history. The portraits capture something textbooks never could, the faces of people who lived through humanity's darkest chapter and chose hope anyway. School visits become particularly powerful experiences. A 90-year-old concentration camp survivor walks into a high school classroom. The teenagers expect a boring history lesson. Instead, they get stories that make their phone screens seem ridiculous in comparison. "I was your age when I decided to help my Jewish neighbors escape," she tells them. "You think you can't make a difference? Think again." These classroom moments create ripple effects nobody anticipates. Students go home and interview their own grandparents. They discover family secrets hidden for generations. The dinner table conversations that started awkwardly become treasured family traditions. Recording equipment becomes essential as families realize time is running out. Voice recordings capture not just the words, but the emotion behind them. The slight pause before describing a friend's death. The change in tone when talking about Liberation Day. These recorded stories become digital time capsules, preserving humanity's most important lessons for people not yet born. But even as these stories pour out, one truth becomes crystal clear: every single survival story is completely unique, and that uniqueness holds the key to understanding something much larger about human nature itself. What do you get when you ask a 90-year-old veteran about surviving World War II? The answer might surprise you. They don't usually talk about strategy or politics first. They talk about hope. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But every survivor who lived through impossible situations mentions this one thing. Hope wasn't just nice to have during the war. It kept people breathing when everything else failed. Take Maria, a Polish woman who spent 3 years hiding in a basement. She survived by believing her son would find her after the war ended. That belief gave her strength to eat moldy bread and drink dirty water without giving up. Her son did find her. But here's the thing, even if he hadn't, that hope still saved her life by keeping her alive long enough for liberation to arrive. Then there's the teamwork angle. War stripped away all the normal social rules pretty quickly. Rich people shared cramped bomb shelters with poor families. Doctors worked alongside farmers to treat wounded soldiers. Kids taught adults how to crawl through tight spaces during escapes. British pilot James Crawford got shot down over France in 1943. A baker, a school teacher, and 2 teenagers worked together to hide him for 6 months. None of these people knew each other before the war. They risked execution to save one stranger. Why? Because crisis has this weird way of showing people what really matters. The most shocking lesson might be this: ordinary people become heroes without even trying. They just do what needs doing next. Martha Johnson was a housewife from Ohio who had never traveled outside her state. During the war, she became a nurse in France and saved dozens of lives. She always said she wasn't brave. Nisha was just too busy helping people to think about being scared. Well, here's where it gets interesting. Every single survival story from World War II is completely different. Some people survived by staying perfectly quiet for months. Others survived by running and never stopping. Some made it through concentration camps by sharing food with strangers. Others survived by hoarding every crumb for themselves. Both approaches worked. Both approaches failed. The war was too big and too chaotic for any single strategy to work everywhere. But that's exactly what makes each story so important. Tommy Williams survived the Bataan Death March by making jokes to keep other prisoners' spirits up. Anna Kowalski survived in hiding by never speaking above a whisper for 2 years. Neither approach would have worked for the other person, but both people lived to tell their stories. Makes sense, right? War doesn't follow rules, so survival couldn't follow rules either. The weirdest part is how war changed everyone who lived through it, even the people who never saw combat. Kids who grew up during rationing never wasted food again, even when they became wealthy adults. Women who worked in factories during the war kept fixing things themselves instead of calling repairmen. Men who came home from battle sometimes became the gentlest fathers you could imagine. Sarah Mitchell was 12 when the London Blitz started. She learned to sleep through bomb explosions. 60 years later, she could still sleep through thunderstorms, construction noise, or anything else. Her granddaughter always wondered how Grandma Sarah could nap anywhere, anytime. The war had trained her brain to rest whenever possible, because you never knew when the next emergency would hit. Let's not forget the flip side. Some survivors couldn't handle sudden loud noises for the rest of their lives. Car backfires made them dive for cover. Fireworks sent them into panic attacks. The same war that made some people incredibly tough made others incredibly sensitive. The lesson isn't that war was good. It definitely wasn't. The lesson is that people are more resilient and more fragile than anyone expects. Sometimes both at the same time. What really sticks with survivors isn't the big dramatic moments you see in movies. It's tiny details. The taste of real butter after years of substitutes. The sound of church bells ringing freely again. The feeling of sleeping in a real bed without listening for air raid sirens. Private First Class Robert Chen kept a single photograph of his family farm throughout 2 years in a Japanese prison camp. Not because the photo was magic, but because it reminded him that normal life still existed somewhere. When he finally made it home, that same farm looked completely different to him. He had changed too much to see it the same way. And the strange truth is this: most survivors say the war taught them more about living than any peaceful time ever could. They learned what they could survive, what really mattered, and how much strength they had hiding inside them. These aren't just old stories collecting dust in history books. These lessons about hope, teamwork, and hidden strength matter right now. Because while the specific crisis changes, people still face impossible situations every single day. What those World War II survivors figured out about human nature still applies. But there's something else those survivors want everyone to understand about war itself. The war ended, but something strange happened. People didn't just move on and forget. They couldn't. Survivors carried invisible scars that lasted decades. Children who hid in basements still flinched at loud noises when they were 60. Former prisoners of war woke up screaming from nightmares 30 years later. The human mind, it turns out, doesn't easily erase memories of terror and survival. But here's what's remarkable. Instead of burying these painful experiences, many survivors decided the world needed to hear them. They understood something crucial. Forgetting would be the most dangerous thing of all. Monuments began appearing in cities across the globe. Not just grand marble structures for generals and politicians, but memorials for ordinary people who died simply because they were Jewish, or Polish, or happened to live in the wrong place at the wrong time. These weren't celebrations of victory. They were promises carved in stone. The most powerful memorial sites weren't always the biggest ones. A simple plaque on a Dutch farmhouse where a family hid refugees. A preserved railway car that once transported prisoners. A small garden where children's shoes are displayed behind glass, each pair representing a life cut short. These quiet spaces hit visitors harder than any statue ever could. Schools started organizing trips to former concentration camps and battlefields. Teenagers walked through places where unimaginable horrors happened just decades before. Many came back changed, suddenly understanding that history wasn't just dates and names in textbooks. Real people their age had lived through these events. Then there's the race against time that began in the 1990s. Survivors were aging, and their first-hand accounts were disappearing forever. Organizations scrambled to record thousands of interviews. Grandchildren sat with tape recorders, finally hearing family stories that had been whispered about but never fully told. Some survivors had waited 50 years to speak. Others never stopped talking, determined to warn future generations. A Holocaust survivor in Chicago visited high schools every week until she was 93. A former prisoner of war in Britain wrote letters to newspapers whenever politicians made careless comments about military action. World leaders made solemn promises at commemoration ceremonies. Never again became a phrase repeated at the United Nations, in parliaments and at memorial services. Politicians shook hands and signed treaties, swearing that such global conflict would never return. But the survivors knew something the politicians sometimes forgot. Preventing future wars wasn't just about international agreements. It was about ordinary people refusing to let hatred take root in their communities. Museums became guardians of memory. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. displays actual artifacts, suitcases packed by families who never came home, children's drawings from ghettos, even strands of hair cut from victims. Visitors walk through in stunned silence, confronting evidence too powerful to deny. Similar museums opened worldwide, each telling local stories of war's impact. In Japan, displays show the devastation of atomic bombs. In Russia, exhibits honor the millions who died defending their homeland. In France, resistance fighters are remembered alongside collaboration's bitter lessons. The weird part is how some people still tried to deny what happened. Despite overwhelming evidence, photographs, film footage, survivor testimonies, Nazi documentation, a small group of people claimed the Holocaust never occurred. This forced an unexpected response. Historical facts had to be legally protected in some countries. Educational curricula changed dramatically. History classes no longer just taught about battles and strategies. Students learned about civilians caught in war, about moral choices ordinary people faced, about how quickly civilized societies could collapse into barbarism. Young people began asking harder questions of their grandparents. What did you know? When did you know it? What did you do? These conversations weren't always comfortable, but they were necessary. Families discovered that their quiet grandmother had hidden refugees, or that their grandfather had witnessed atrocities he'd never discussed. Technology created new ways to preserve memory. Virtual reality experiences let people walk through historical sites. Online databases collected millions of documents, photos and testimonies. Social media connected survivors' descendants across continents, sharing family histories and honoring lost relatives. The most important lesson emerged gradually. Preventing future horrors required more than remembering past ones. It demanded teaching empathy, critical thinking, and the courage to speak up when witnessing injustice. History's darkest chapters revealed both humanity's capacity for evil and its potential for extraordinary goodness. Every generation faces this choice anew. Will they learn from the past or repeat its mistakes? Will they stand up for neighbors under threat, or look the other way when it's convenient? The survivor's message echoes across decades. Ordinary people have the power to choose compassion over cruelty, truth over lies, courage over cowardice. Their stories weren't just about surviving war, they were instruction manuals for building a more decent world. But as we'll see, the task of never forgetting requires constant vigilance, because human nature hasn't fundamentally changed since 1940.